My name is Madison, 29 years old, and I was fighting for my life against Hodgkin lymphoma. But the cancer was not the most toxic thing I had to deal with. On what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, standing at the altar in front of 300 elite guests, my own sister lunged forward and ripped the bridal wig right off my head. As I stood there exposed and humiliated, my mother did not rush to comfort me. Instead, she stepped forward with a malicious smirk and announced to the entire congregation that the groom deserved a real woman, not a bald ghost. She thought that was the end of me. She assumed I would crumble in shame, but my family had absolutely no idea what I had prepared for them. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who tried to break you. The air inside the historic downtown Chicago cathedral was heavy with the scent of white roses and expensive perfume. It was the social event of the season, a wedding designed to impress the city elite. 300 guests filled the polished oak pews, wearing designer suits and custom gowns. Sunlight streamed through the massive stained glass windows, casting vibrant colors across the marble floor. I stood at the altar holding a bouquet of orchids, trying to focus on the man standing across from me. Connor was 31 years old, a highly successful hedge fund manager with a charming smile and a tailored tuxedo. He looked like the perfect groom straight out of a magazine spread. I worked as a medical data analyst for a major health technology corporation. My life used to be driven by algorithms, research, and quiet stability. That all changed when I was diagnosed with Hodgkin lymphoma. The aggressive chemotherapy treatments had saved my life and put me into remission, but they had also taken a severe toll on my body. I was painfully thin, my skin was pale, and I had lost every single strand of my hair. For the wedding, I had purchased an incredibly expensive custom-made bridal wig. It was beautifully styled into soft blonde waves, complete with a delicate lace veil. It was meant to make me feel normal for just one day. I wanted to forget the hospital rooms and the treatments and simply be a beautiful bride. Standing at the altar, my heart pounded against my ribs. The string quartet had just finished playing and the vast cathedral was completely silent. The pastor, a distinguished man in flowing robes, opened his leather-bound book. He looked between Connor and me, offering a warm, reassuring smile. He cleared his throat and began speaking the traditional vows, his voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. He reached the pivotal question, asking Connor if he promised to love, honor, and cherish me in sickness and in health. Before Connor could even open his mouth to respond, a sudden commotion broke out in the front row. My younger sister Sydney, who was 26 and a self-proclaimed lifestyle influencer, stood up abruptly. Sydney was supposed to be my maid of honor, though she treated my wedding like it was her own personal content creation event. She was wearing a completely inappropriate emerald gown that she had chosen specifically to draw attention away from me. Sydney let out a dramatic, exaggerated gasp. She stumbled forward, her stiletto heel supposedly catching on the hem of her overly long dress. But her movements were entirely too calculated. She did not fall toward the floor. Instead, she lunged aggressively up the altar steps directly toward me. Her hands shot out, fingers curled like claws. Before I could process what was happening or step away, she grabbed a fistful of my blonde bridal wig. With a violent, forceful yank, she ripped the wig and the attached veil completely off my head. The physical force of the pull snapped my neck backward, and the sharp bobby pins that secured the wig scraped painfully against my bare scalp. The beautiful blonde waves, the delicate lace, the illusion of normalcy, all of it was gone in a fraction of a second. Sydney stumbled back, clutching my wig in her hands, her face arranged in an expression of manufactured shock. A collective gasp rippled through the 300 guests. The sound was deafening in the cavernous church. People shifted in their pews, whispering frantically, staring at me with wide, horrified eyes. I stood completely exposed under the bright, unforgiving light of the stained glass windows. My bare, bald head was visible to the entire Chicago elite. I felt the cold air hit my scalp, a stark reminder of my illness and the agonizing months of chemotherapy I had just endured. My hands trembled as I gripped my bouquet, my knuckles turning white. I waited for someone to intervene. I waited for the pastor to say something to restore order. Most of all, I waited for my mother to rush forward and cover me to protect her sick daughter from this public humiliation. But Catherine, my mother, did no such thing. Catherine was a woman obsessed with social status appearances and maintaining a flawless public image. She had always viewed my illness not as a tragedy to be supported, but as an ugly inconvenience that ruined her perfect family portrait. She slowly stood up from the very front pew. She smoothed down the front of her expensive silk suit, completely unbothered by the chaos my sister had just caused. She stepped forward, walking right up to the very edge of the altar. She looked at me shivering and stripped of all dignity. There was no pity in her eyes. Instead, she smirked maliciously. "The groom deserves a real woman," she announced, "not a bald ghost." Her cruel words hung in the cathedral air, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings and settling over the congregation like a thick, suffocating blanket. 300 guests held their collective breath. Every single eye shifted from my mother standing triumphant at the edge of the pews to the man standing directly across from me. Connor, my handsome, seemingly devoted groom. The man who had promised to stand by my side through the darkest, most terrifying valleys of my cancer diagnosis. The man who was supposed to be my fierce protector. I looked into his eyes, waiting for the righteous anger I thought I would see. I waited for him to step forward to shield my exposed head from the glaring lights, to reprimand my mother and sister for their grotesque display of cruelty. I waited for him to pull me into his chest and tell the entire room that he loved me exactly as I was. But the warmth in his eyes was completely gone. In its place was a chilling, undeniable revulsion. Connor stared at my bare scalp as if he were looking at a monster. The blood drained from his face, leaving his typically sun-kissed skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw slacked, and the charming smile that had initially won my heart vanished, replaced by a grimace of pure disgust. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled his hands out of mine. The physical withdrawal was so sharp, so violently rejecting, it felt worse than the moment my sister ripped the wig from my head. He wiped his palms against the sides of his tailored tuxedo trousers, literally treating my touch as if my illness were a contagious disease he desperately needed to scrub away. A heavy, agonizing silence consumed the church. You could hear the faint rustle of silk and the uncomfortable shifting of the Chicago elite as they waited for the groom to do anything to salvage the ceremony. Instead, Connor took a step backward, putting physical distance between us. He stared at the marble floor, completely unwilling to meet my gaze. The beautiful illusion of our relationship was crumbling right before my eyes, leaving nothing but the ugly truth of his cowardice. "I am sorry," he muttered. His voice was weak, barely above a whisper, yet it echoed through the silent cathedral. He did not say it to me. He did not look at me. He addressed the front row of guests, looking specifically toward his wealthy parents, and my malicious mother, seeking their approval for his abandonment. "I cannot do this," Connor stammered, shaking his head as he took another large step backward. "I just cannot do this. I am so sorry." With those pathetic, cowardly words, he turned his back on me. He did not run, but his strides were fast and purposeful as he walked down the altar steps, moving past my mother, moving past my sister, and heading straight down the center aisle toward the heavy oak doors of the church. The man I was supposed to marry was retreating, leaving his sick, exposed bride completely alone in front of hundreds of staring strangers. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind him, sealing his decision. The congregation erupted into a low, frantic murmur. Whispers hissed through the pews like venomous snakes. I could see the pity flashing in the eyes of my extended relatives, their faces contorted with secondhand embarrassment. I could see the thinly veiled amusement on the faces of my mother's country club friends, women who thrived on the destruction of others. They were watching a train wreck unfold in real time. They absolutely expected me to crumble. They expected my knees to give out, for me to collapse onto the cold marble and dissolve into a puddle of hysterical broken sobs. They waited for the sick, abandoned woman to weep over her ruined wedding day, begging for someone to save her. But not a single tear formed in my eyes. My heart, which had been racing just moments before, suddenly settled into a slow, rhythmic, and incredibly steady beat. The panic that should have consumed me evaporated entirely, leaving behind a profound, icy clarity that sharpened every detail in the room. The stinging air against my bare scalp no longer felt like a humiliation. It felt like a baptism. It felt like complete and utter freedom. I slowly lowered my gaze to the floor. There, resting against the polished white stone, lay the custom blonde wig. The delicate lace was slightly torn from where Sydney's manicured claws had aggressively ripped it away. The synthetic waves looked entirely out of place on the cold ground, a discarded remnant of the fragile facade I had been forced to maintain for their comfort. With absolute unhurried grace, I bent down. The heavy silk of my wedding gown rustled softly in the quiet church as I crouched. I reached out and picked up the wig, feeling the cheap texture of the synthetic hair against my fingers. I stood back up, my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders pulled back with an intense, unshakable pride. Holding the hairpiece, I gently, methodically brushed the invisible dust off its strands, refusing to show a single ounce of shame. I looked at my mother. Catherine stood just a few feet away, her malicious smirk faltering ever so slightly as she failed to see the devastation she so desperately wanted to inflict. I looked at Sydney, who was still standing near the altar steps, her face twisted in a mixture of fake shock and genuine confusion at my complete lack of an emotional breakdown. And then I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a smile of forgiveness or acceptance. It was a bone-chilling, razor-sharp curve of the lips that held zero warmth and zero mercy. It was the smile of an apex predator realizing the cage door had just been left wide open. My family thought they had orchestrated the ultimate public execution. They believed they had successfully cornered a weak, dying woman and stripped her of her last shred of dignity. They thought this highly public humiliation was my tragic ending. They were so incredibly wrong. This was not a tragedy. This was my green light. For weeks, I had been silently enduring their cruelty, gathering their dark secrets, and meticulously laying a network of invisible, devastating financial traps. I had desperately needed a catalyst, a public, undeniable breach of contract to activate the total ruin I had carefully designed for them. By ripping off my wig, by publicly mocking my illness, and by Connor cowardly abandoning me at the altar, they had just handed me the detonator. Every single piece of my master plan was now in motion. They had taken the bait perfectly, walking right into the crosshairs. I stood completely bareheaded under the cathedral lights, holding my ruined wig, and I felt nothing but a thrilling, dangerous anticipation for the absolute destruction that was about to rain down upon them. The whispers in the cathedral grew louder, a buzzing hive of gossip that I knew would spread across Chicago by nightfall. Let them whisper. Let them spread the story of the broken bride. They were entirely oblivious to the reality that my tears had dried up months ago. The sick, vulnerable girl they thought they were destroying was already dead, replaced by a woman who refused to be a victim. The game had finally begun. The foundation of my revenge was laid exactly 3 months before this moment at the altar. The memory of how this war truly began shifted my focus from the murmuring church crowd back to the sterile, unforgiving walls of an oncology ward. 3 months prior, I was not wearing custom silk or holding a bridal bouquet. I was tethered to a cold steel IV pole in a freezing hospital room, undergoing one of the most grueling and aggressive chemotherapy sessions of my entire treatment plan. The rhythmic, monotonous beeping of the heart monitor and the slow, steady drip of toxic, life-saving chemicals into my veins were the only sounds keeping me company. My body felt like it was made of solid lead, every single muscle aching with a deep, bone-chilling fatigue. My skin was pale and translucent under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, marking the severe physical toll the Hodgkin lymphoma was taking on my system. I had been staring blankly at the ceiling tiles, trying desperately to distract myself from the intense nausea twisting my stomach, clinging to the foolish hope that someone from my family might actually show up to offer a shred of comfort or support. The heavy wooden door to my ward suddenly swung open with a loud, abrasive thud. The jarring noise sent a sharp jolt of pain directly through my throbbing head. I turned weakly toward the entrance, fully expecting a nurse to come in and check my vitals or adjust the flow of my medication. Instead, my mother Catherine and my younger sister Sydney marched into the sterile room. They looked as though they had just stepped off a high society fashion runway, completely out of place in a wing dedicated to the severely ill. Catherine was draped in a tailored beige designer trench coat, a premium leather handbag slung over her forearm, her posture perfectly rigid and commanding. Sydney trailed right behind her, busy adjusting the strap of her oversized expensive sunglasses and completely absorbed in checking her reflection on her phone screen. There were no colorful bouquets of flowers in their hands. There were no warm cups of coffee, no soft blankets, no sympathetic smiles, and absolutely no words of comfort. The grim reality of the hospital environment seemed entirely beneath them. Catherine did not bother asking how I was feeling. She did not approach the edge of the mattress to hold my hand or offer a gentle maternal touch. She marched straight to the side of my bed, reaching her perfectly manicured hand into her expensive leather tote bag. She pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents stapled together. Without a single ounce of hesitation or a word of greeting, she tossed the heavy manila folder directly onto my lap. The papers slid slightly, resting heavy against the thin, scratchy hospital blanket covering my frail legs. I stared down at the bold, capitalized black letters printed across the top page. It was a property transfer deed. My foggy, chemo-addled brain struggled to comprehend what I was looking at. I looked up at my mother, my throat incredibly dry, expecting some sort of logical explanation. Catherine crossed her arms tightly over her chest and delivered her demands with the chilling, ruthless efficiency of a corporate raider liquidating a bankrupt asset. She bluntly commanded me to sign over the deed to my premium, fully paid-off downtown Chicago condo. It was a luxurious, high-rise property, boasting panoramic views of the city skyline, an asset I had purchased entirely with my own hard-earned money from years of working grueling hours as a medical data analyst. Catherine stared down at my pale, sickly face and rationalized her demand with a calculated coldness that instantly froze the blood in my veins. She stated, completely devoid of any human emotion, that my medical treatments were threatening to drain the family resources, conveniently ignoring the fact that I was paying for my own health care entirely. She then looked me dead in the eye and delivered a sentence that would permanently sever our relationship. She told me I probably would not survive much longer anyway, and holding on to a multi-million-dollar real estate asset while I was dying was a selfish, irresponsible waste. Sydney finally managed to tear her eyes away from her phone screen to chime in, completely agreeing with our mother's horrific, deeply disturbing assessment. My younger sister stepped closer to the hospital bed, wrinkling her nose as she complained about the harsh lighting in the room. She dramatically sighed and explained that her lifestyle influencer career was supposedly on the verge of a massive, lucrative breakthrough. According to Sydney, she desperately needed a proper headquarters to film her daily content, host high-profile brand meetings, and project the wealthy, successful aesthetic required to grow her online following. My beautiful modern condo in the heart of the city was exactly the backdrop she needed to secure those brand deals. They had convinced themselves and expected me to agree that seizing my home was not an act of theft, but a necessary strategic business maneuver to save the family from the perceived burden of my impending medical debts. Lying there in that stiff hospital bed, the chemical poison dripping directly into my arm felt far less toxic than the two women standing over me. They were not looking at a daughter or a sister fighting a terrifying, painful battle against cancer. They were looking at a dying woman strictly as an opportunity for a real estate acquisition. They wanted me to literally sign away my sanctuary, my financial safety net, and my entire life's work, so Sydney could have a pretty background for her internet videos. Catherine impatiently tapped a silver pen against the plastic edge of my hospital tray, demanding my signature immediately so they could file the paperwork before the city clerk's office closed for the weekend. The sheer audacity, the absolute chilling lack of empathy stripped away whatever lingering foolish illusions I still held about my family. That was the exact moment my sadness died, metamorphosing into a cold, unbreakable resolve to survive and destroy them. The sharp tapping of the silver pen against my plastic hospital tray echoed like a countdown. Catherine leaned closer, her designer perfume competing with the sterile smell of rubbing alcohol. She thrust the property transfer deed toward my chest, her impeccably manicured nail pressing exactly where she expected me to surrender my life savings. Sydney stood right beside her, arms crossed, already visualizing where she would place her vanity mirrors in my living room. I stared at the pen, my vision blurring slightly from the chemotherapy, completely paralyzed by the sheer evil radiating from my own blood relatives. Just as Catherine opened her mouth to issue another venomous demand, the heavy wooden door of the ward swung open. Jamal stepped over the threshold, stopping dead in his tracks. He was 32 years old, an exceptionally sharp African-American man who worked as a top-tier forensic accountant for a massive downtown firm. Unfortunately for him, he was also Sydney's husband. He stood tall in his tailored charcoal suit, clutching a worn leather briefcase. His warm, intelligent eyes darted from the legal documents resting on my lap to the silver pen in Catherine's hand, and finally to the utterly pathetic expression on Sydney's face. It took Jamal less than 3 seconds to calculate exactly what was happening. As a forensic accountant, he made a living analyzing discrepancies and spotting predators. He did not need a spreadsheet to see the sickening extortion taking place in this hospital room. His expression morphed from confusion into absolute blinding disgust. He dropped his briefcase onto the visitor chair with a heavy thud. Before Catherine could formulate a lie, Jamal crossed the room in 3 long strides. He reached out and snatched the property transfer deed right off my blanket. His movements were swift, decisive, and fueled by a righteous anger that instantly shifted the power dynamic in the room. Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her pearls in a dramatic display of manufactured outrage. She demanded to know what he thought he was doing, claiming it was private family business. Jamal did not give her an inch. He crumpled the thick stack of legal documents in his large fist, the sound of tearing paper slicing through the tense silence. He looked his mother-in-law dead in the eye and told her that extorting a cancer patient for real estate was not family business, it was a felony. Sydney immediately stepped forward to defend her mother, her voice pitching into a shrill register. She tried to grab her husband's arm, whining about her influencer career and how they desperately needed the condo space for her brand deals. Jamal looked down at his wife with a mixture of profound pity and intense revulsion. He physically shrugged off her hand as if her touch burned him. He pointed his finger directly toward the open doorway. His voice was dangerously low, carrying a lethal authority that commanded absolute obedience. He ordered both of them to get out of my room immediately. Catherine attempted to stand her ground, puffing out her chest and threatening to call security. Jamal countered without missing a beat. He offered to call the police himself and show them the coerced property deed they were trying to force a heavily medicated patient to sign. That shut Catherine up instantly. Her bravado evaporated, replaced by the panicked realization of her own legal exposure. She grabbed her designer handbag, spun on her heel, and marched out into the corridor. Sydney scrambled after her, throwing a vicious tantrum. Jamal followed his wife into the brightly lit hospital hallway. For the next 5 minutes, I sat in my bed listening to the muffled but incredibly vicious argument echoing through the thick drywall. I could hear Sydney shrieking about how he never supported her dreams and how he was sabotaging her future. I heard Jamal's deep, booming voice cutting through her hysteria, telling her he refused to be married to a parasite who fed on her own dying sister. The sheer finality in his tone sent a shockwave through the corridor. The rapid clicking of high heels eventually faded away down the hall as Catherine and Sydney retreated in absolute defeat. The hospital room door slowly creaked open, and Jamal stepped back inside. He looked exhausted, rubbing a hand aggressively across his face. He walked over to the door handle, engaged the heavy metal deadbolt, and secured the room. The solid click of the lock provided an instant, unexpected sense of safety. He walked back to the visitor chair, picked up his leather briefcase, and pulled it onto his lap. The anger had completely drained from his face, replaced by a deep, highly unsettling, professional gravity. He pulled up a chair right next to my bed, leaning in close so his voice would not carry beyond the locked door. He apologized for the horrific scene, assuring me that my condo was safe and that he would personally shred the transfer deed. But then his eyes darkened. He told me that Sydney and Catherine were not the reason he had rushed to the oncology ward today. Jamal popped the brass latches on his briefcase. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, highly classified audit folder, its edges worn from heavy use. The folder was stamped with bright red confidentiality warnings. He laid it gently on the edge of my hospital tray, treating it like a live explosive. 2 years ago, before my diagnosis, I had founded a federal patient relief charity designed to help low-income pediatric cancer patients afford experimental treatments. It was my passion project and organization I had poured my heart into. When I got sick, I was forced to step away from the daily operations, leaving the administrative control to the board. Jamal looked at me, his expression grave and unyielding. He explained that a few weeks ago he had noticed a strange discrepancy in his own household finances, specifically a massive influx of cash into Sydney's personal accounts. Suspicious, he had quietly used his forensic accounting credentials to trace the routing numbers backward. He tapped the classified folder with his index finger. He warned me to brace myself. He had uncovered a massive, incredibly sinister financial anomaly. The money flooding into his wife's bank account was not coming from brand deals or sponsorships. It was being systematically and illegally siphoned directly out of the pediatric cancer charity I had built. My own family was embezzling federal funds meant for dying children, and Jamal had brought the paper trail to prove it. I stared at the thick manila folder resting on my tray table, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my fragile ribs. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was paralyzing. It was one thing for my mother and sister to attempt to steal my personal real estate while I was incapacitated by chemotherapy. It was an entirely different universe of depravity to steal life-saving resources from sick, vulnerable children. He opened the folder, flipping past dozens of highlighted bank statements, forged withdrawal slips, and redacted wire transfers. He explained the mechanics of the fraud with cold, clinical precision. Catherine, utilizing the emergency power of attorney I had foolishly granted her when my cancer aggressively progressed, had accessed the charity's main federal holding accounts. Instead of managing the funds for the pediatric wards, as she was legally obligated to do, she had set up a complex series of dummy vendor accounts. She was writing checks for phantom medical supplies and funneling the clean cash directly back into her own pockets and into Sydney's personal checking accounts. Jamal warned me that because my name was still listed as the primary founder and director of the charity, I could be held criminally liable by the federal government if the embezzlement was discovered by an outside agency. They had not just stolen money, they had unknowingly set me up to take the fall for a federal crime. The locked hospital room suddenly felt like a shrinking cage, and the full, terrifying weight of my family's treachery finally crushed the last remaining fragments of my innocence. The terrifying revelation in that hospital room changed the trajectory of my entire existence. But the true depth of my family's depravity did not fully hit me until a few weeks before the wedding. I had been discharged from the oncology ward and was resting in the very downtown condo my mother had tried to steal from me. Jamal and I had been quietly working in the shadows, building a fortress of evidence against Catherine and Sydney. I was physically weak, spending most of my days wrapped in heavy blankets, but my mind was sharper than ever. I was scheduled to begin a highly specialized, life-saving experimental trial. This new immunotherapy was the critical final step in my treatment protocol, designed to completely eradicate the remaining microscopic traces of the Hodgkin lymphoma and guarantee my long-term survival. It was my ultimate light at the end of a very dark, agonizing tunnel. I was sitting on my living room sofa, sipping a cup of hot ginger tea to settle my perpetually churning stomach, when my phone vibrated against the glass coffee table. The caller ID displayed the name of my primary oncology coordinator at the research hospital. I answered immediately, expecting a routine confirmation call regarding my admission date for the trial. Instead, the voice on the other end of the line was tight with professional concern. The coordinator took a deep breath and informed me that there was a catastrophic problem with my file. She stated that my premium health insurance provider had abruptly denied all coverage for the experimental immunotherapy trial. That was shocking enough, as my policy was top tier and fully comprehensive. But the coordinator was not finished. She explained that the hospital billing department had attempted to process the initial out-of-pocket deposit required to secure my spot in the trial program. The auto draft had bounced. The transaction was rejected by my bank due to insufficient funds. My fingers tightened around the ceramic mug until my knuckles turned stark white. I told the coordinator there had to be a clerical error. I had carefully managed my finances for years, maintaining a robust checking account specifically dedicated to covering any unexpected medical expenses. I assured her I would contact my bank immediately to resolve the block and wire the funds directly by the end of the business day. I hung up the phone, my heart suddenly hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I grabbed my laptop from the side table and hurriedly opened my internet browser. My hands shook so violently that it took me 3 attempts to type in my banking portal address. I entered my secure login credentials, navigating directly to my primary checking and standard savings accounts. The screen refreshed, loading the dashboard interface. I stared at the numbers displayed on the glowing monitor, my breath hitching in my throat. The balances were completely decimated. Accounts that had held tens of thousands of dollars just days prior now displayed double digits. A sweeping, chilling panic clawed its way up my throat. This was not a minor banking error. My actual physical survival was suddenly on the line. Without those funds, I would lose my place in the clinical trial, leaving me entirely vulnerable to a deadly cancer relapse. I clicked on the transaction history, my eyes scanning the ledger in absolute horror. There was a rapid, methodical series of maximum allowable transfers executed over the past 48 hours. The money had been systematically bled out, funneled into offshore routing numbers I did not recognize. I felt the air leave my lungs. I slammed the laptop shut for a fraction of a second, fighting the urge to vomit. But I could not afford to collapse. I still had my emergency reserves. Years ago, I had set up a completely separate, high-yield financial portfolio with a different investment firm. It was my ultimate safety net, a locked vault of capital intended for catastrophic emergencies, just like this one. I reopened the laptop, typing in the URL for the investment firm. I quickly entered my username and my complex multi-character password. I clicked the login button, waiting for the security dashboard to grant me access so I could liquidate the necessary assets and save my own life. A bright red error message flashed across the screen. Access denied. Invalid credentials. I frowned, assuming my trembling fingers had simply hit the wrong key. I carefully retyped the password, checking each letter and number. I hit enter again. The same glaring red error message appeared, mocking my rising panic. I clicked the password recovery link, entering my personal email address to receive the reset instructions. The system returned a prompt stating that the primary email associated with the account had been recently changed. It asked me to answer my secondary security questions to verify my identity. The first question loaded on the screen. What is the name of your first pet? I typed the answer. The system rejected it. I tried the second question. In what city did your parents meet? I typed the answer. Rejected. A profound, paralyzing terror washed over me instantly, followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated fury. The security questions had been altered. The recovery email had been hijacked. The passwords had been completely changed. I was entirely locked out of my own life savings. The realization hit me with the force of a speeding freight train. I had been financially sabotaged from the inside. I knew exactly who had the capability to execute this level of destruction. Catherine. I rushed to revoke her power of attorney when Jamal warned me, but I underestimated her speed. Before the revocation process through my financial institutions, she weaponized the document. Catherine had walked into a bank branch, presented the legal paperwork granting her total authority over my affairs, and systematically locked me out of my wealth. The sheer magnitude of that realization should have broken me. It should have sent me spiraling into a pit of hopeless despair, weeping over my stolen future and my impending doom. Instead, a terrifying, unnatural calm washed over me. I did not scream. I did not throw my laptop against the wall. I simply reached across the glass coffee table and pulled Jamal's worn leather briefcase toward me. If Catherine wanted to play a game of financial warfare using my life as collateral, she had severely underestimated the woman she was trying to bury. I was a medical data analyst by trade. My entire career was built on finding anomalies, decrypting complex systems, and tracing impossible patterns. They had locked me out of the front door of my own finances, but Jamal had just handed me the master keys to their back alleys. I opened the classified audit folder Jamal had risked his own career to compile. The red confidentiality stamps glared up at me, a stark reminder of the felony occurring under the guise of family management. I spent the next 14 hours diving into the dark web of my own financial ruin. I cross-referenced the routing numbers Jamal had flagged with the public records of my pediatric cancer charity. I bypassed the standard banking portals using back-end verification tools I had mastered in my analytics work to trace the shadow accounts Catherine had set up. The deeper I dug, the more sickening the picture became. The raw data did not lie, and it painted a portrait of greed so grotesque it defied human comprehension. The total figure was exactly $150,000. That was the precise amount Catherine had systematically embezzled from the charity's relief fund over the course of 2 months. She had utilized the emergency power of attorney to authorize massive wire transfers, masking them as operational expenses and emergency medical grants. But the money was not going to dying children. I followed the digital breadcrumbs directly to the recipient accounts. The first massive chunk of stolen charity funds had been wired to a luxury automotive dealership. Sydney, my vain, vacuous sister, who had stood in my hospital room complaining about my medical debts, was now driving a brand new, fully loaded Porsche Macan. She had literally bought her dream car with money meant to keep pediatric cancer patients alive. The remaining funds were equally easy to track. Catherine had not bothered to cover her tracks with much sophistication, assuming my impending death would erase all evidence. Tens of thousands of dollars had been funneled directly to the Oakwood Country Club. My mother had been drowning in secret, exorbitant social debts, desperately trying to maintain her wealthy facade among her high society friends. She had paid off her overdue membership fees, covered months of extravagant dining tabs, and even booked premium event spaces using the stolen cash. They were sipping vintage champagne and revving a German sports car engine while I was being denied entry to a life-saving clinical trial due to insufficient funds. The instinct to pick up my phone and dial the police was overwhelming. I wanted to drag them out of their affluent lives in handcuffs. I wanted to watch the authorities repossess the Porsche and publicly march Catherine out of her precious country club. But I stopped myself. Confronting them now, or alerting the authorities prematurely, would give them a chance to panic, destroy evidence, or spin a narrative of a misunderstanding. If I struck now, I might recover the money, but I would not achieve total destruction. I realized that my silence was the most lethal weapon I possessed. As long as they believed I was a dying, ignorant victim blindly trusting their management, they would continue to be careless. They would keep spending, keep stealing, and keep digging their own graves. I chose to weaponize my silence. However, before I could exact my revenge, I had a much more immediate problem to solve. I needed to secure my spot in the experimental immunotherapy trial, and I needed millions of dollars to guarantee my long-term survival and fund my retaliation. Catherine thought she had stripped me of all my valuable assets by targeting my real estate and liquid cash. She was entirely oblivious to the intellectual property I owned. Before my diagnosis, I had spent 3 years developing a proprietary medical data algorithm designed to predict patient outcomes based on microscopic genetic markers. It was a revolutionary piece of software that my former employer had been desperate to acquire, but I had retained full exclusive ownership rights. I reached out directly to the CEO of a rival medical tech giant, a man who had been trying to buy my algorithm for years. The negotiation was swift, absolutely ruthless, and conducted entirely under the radar. I bypassed the standard corporate acquisition channels, demanding an expedited confidential transfer of the intellectual property in exchange for a massive upfront cash buyout. Knowing the immense market value of the code, the CEO agreed within hours. The paperwork was signed digitally, and the transaction was completed with blistering speed. I did not deposit the proceeds into any account Catherine knew existed. I funneled the tens of millions of dollars into an offshore, completely untraceable shell corporation I established under a fictitious name. From that anonymous entity, I wired the required deposit directly to the research hospital, securing my place in the experimental trial under an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. My health and my survival were officially guaranteed. My mother and sister were completely unaware that the sick, penniless woman they were plotting to bury had just become wealthier and more powerful than they could possibly fathom. With my physical future secured and endless resources at my disposal, I began laying the intricate, invisible wires of a bulletproof financial trap, ready to let them walk right into their own absolute ruin. 2 weeks remained until the grand cathedral wedding. 2 weeks until I was scheduled to walk down the marble aisle and bind my life to Connor in front of 300 elite guests. It was also the day of my final scheduled chemotherapy session before transitioning into the experimental immunotherapy trial I had just secretly funded. The chemical cocktail pumped into my veins that morning was particularly ruthless. A wave of debilitating nausea hit me mid-drip, turning my vision gray and twisting my stomach into tight, painful knots. My body violently rejected the treatment, leaving me shivering under the thin hospital blankets. The nurses, alarmed by my sudden spike in blood pressure and severe pallor, decided to halt the infusion early. They administered a heavy dose of anti-nausea medication and advised me to go straight home to rest. I hailed a quiet ride back to my downtown condo, staring out the window at the bustling Chicago streets. Physically, I felt like a hollow, brittle shell of myself, but mentally, I was operating on a level of pure, razor-sharp clarity. I had spent the last few weeks secretly moving my new fortune, setting up airtight legal structures, and quietly observing my family's oblivious greed. I was looking forward to the utter silence of my home, a place to close my eyes and simply breathe without having to perform for anyone. I slid my key into the lock of my front door, turning it with practiced silence. I stepped into the foyer, gently pushing the heavy oak door shut behind me until it clicked securely. I slipped off my flats, wanting nothing more than to walk softly to my bedroom and collapse. But as I padded across the polished hardwood floors, a sound made me freeze in my tracks. It was a soft, muffled laugh drifting down the hallway from the direction of the main living room. My condo was supposed to be completely empty. I lived alone, and Connor was supposedly at his architectural firm, finalizing blueprints for a major client. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It was not the ambient noise of a forgotten television. It was the distinct, intimate sound of two people sharing a private moment. I crept forward, pressing my back against the cool plaster of the hallway wall. I moved with agonizing slowness, my stocking feet completely silent against the floorboards. I reached the wide arched entrance of the living room and carefully peered around the edge of the drywall. The afternoon sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting bright, warm light across my custom Italian leather sofa. And right there, bathed in the sunlight of my own home, were two figures intensely and unmistakably entangled. My breath caught in my throat. It was Sydney. My younger sister was practically straddling the man I was supposed to marry in exactly 14 days. Connor. My devoted, supposedly heartbroken fiancé, whose hands were currently gripping her waist with an aggressive, sickening familiarity. The same sister whose husband Jamal had just risked his own career and freedom to defend me in the hospital ward. They were kissing deeply, their bodies pressed together in a vile display of complete betrayal. The old Madison would have gasped. She would have screamed, dropped her purse, and collapsed into a puddle of weeping devastation right there in the hallway. She would have demanded answers, begged for an explanation, and let her heart shatter into a million irreparable pieces. But the old Madison had died the day Catherine threw a property deed onto her hospital bed. The new Madison, fueled by absolute clarity and tens of millions of untraceable dollars, felt no heartbreak. I felt only the cold, calculating thrill of an apex predator spotting its prey. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out my smartphone. I swiftly silenced all notifications, turned the volume down to 0, and swiped open the camera application. I hit the red record button. Holding the device perfectly steady around the edge of the archway, I began capturing their grotesque charade in high-definition video. Connor pulled back from the kiss, brushing a lock of Sydney's blonde hair behind her ear. He let out a long, heavy groan, tilting his head back against the sofa cushions. Sydney giggled, tracing her manicured fingernail along his jawline. She pouted her lips and asked him how much longer he had to play the devoted, tragic groom. Connor sighed, rubbing his face in mock exhaustion. He complained bitterly to my sister about the sheer burden of our relationship. Then he delivered the words that would forever seal his fate in my grand design. He told Sydney that he could barely stomach the sight of me anymore. He referred to me, his dying fiancé, as a repulsive bald ghost. He whined about how sickening it felt to touch my frail, sickly body shivering with exaggerated disgust as he recalled having to hold my hand in public just to maintain the illusion of the loyal partner. He told her that every time he had to kiss my cheek, he had to hold his breath. Sydney did not slap him. She did not defend her sick sister. Instead, she purred in agreement, leaning down to kiss his neck. She whispered that he only had to hold out for a little while longer. She reminded him of the ultimate payoff. The cathedral wedding had to happen so they could solidify the legal ties and the public optics before my inevitable demise. Once we were married, and I was in the ground, Connor would legally inherit whatever assets Catherine could not pilfer through her fraudulent charity schemes. They were conspiring to divide my life, my wealth, and my legacy between them, like vultures picking over a fresh carcass. I kept the camera rolling, capturing every vile syllable, every callous insult, every undeniable frame of their infidelity. My stomach churned, but the physical nausea of the chemotherapy was entirely replaced by a rush of cold clinical adrenaline. This was not a tragedy unfolding before my eyes. This was pristine, irrefutable leverage. Jamal had already warned me about Sydney's financial crimes, but now I held the perfect weapon to dismantle her personal life and absolutely obliterate Connor's pristine golden boy reputation. I had seen and heard exactly what I needed. I tapped the screen to stop the recording, ensuring the video file was securely saved and automatically backed up to my newly encrypted cloud server. I silently backed away from the living room archway, retreating down the long hallway with the same stealth I had used to approach. I eased the heavy front door open, slipped out into the corridor, and pulled it shut with a soft, undetectable click. I stood alone in the hallway outside my condo, clutching my phone tightly against my chest. The final devastating piece of ammunition was locked and loaded. They thought I was a fragile, bald ghost waiting to die. They had no idea they were already haunting a graveyard of their own making. Standing in the quiet, carpeted corridor outside my front door, I pulled my wireless earbuds from my coat pocket and pushed them into my ears. My hands were remarkably steady, completely devoid of the tremors that usually accompanied a fresh dose of chemotherapy. I swiped open my phone and hit play on the high-definition video file I had just captured. The audio fed directly into my ears, crisp and undeniably incriminating. I watched the screen intently, observing the footage of Connor pulling Sydney closer against the cushions of my own living room sofa. It was the final 30 seconds of the clip captured just as I was slowly backing away toward the front door that delivered the ultimate devastating motive. Connor's voice cracked on the playback, not with the heavy burden of grief or the exhaustion of caring for a sick partner, but with a frantic, desperate greed. He leaned his forehead against my sister's shoulder and confessed the ugly truth about his pristine, highly acclaimed boutique hedge fund. It was not just struggling in a tough market, it was in an absolute unrecoverable freefall. A series of disastrous, highly leveraged bets on volatile tech startups had pushed his firm to the brink of catastrophic collapse. His wealthy, demanding investors were circling his office like bloodthirsty sharks, demanding quarterly returns he simply did not possess. He admitted to Sydney that he was mere days away from total financial ruin, complete professional disgrace, and a potential federal indictment for grossly mishandling client capital. Then came the sickening punchline, the revelation that cemented his doom. Connor looked deep into Sydney's eyes and promised her that their terrifying financial nightmare was almost over. He stated flatly, without a single ounce of hesitation or remorse, that he was only going through with our grand cathedral wedding to secure his ironclad legal status as my primary beneficiary. The prize was not my enduring love, nor was it my real estate portfolio. It was my $3 million life insurance policy. He callously calculated the timeline of my illness, telling Sydney that my aggressive cancer would surely finish me off within 6 months of the wedding ceremony. Once the massive insurance payout cleared the bank, he planned to immediately liquidate his failing firm, take the $3 million in clean cash, and flee with my sister to a luxury expatriate haven where they could live out their twisted parasite fantasy. I pocketed my phone, staring at the polished brass numbers on my apartment door. There were no tears blurring my vision, no dramatic gasps for air, and zero heartbreak. The last remaining ounce of affection I held for the man I thought I loved evaporated, replaced by a cold, impenetrable armor. I simply turned on my heel and walked down the long, silent hallway toward the elevator bank. I pressed the call button, rode the mirrored cab down to the ground floor lobby, and walked out through the revolving glass doors into the crisp, biting Chicago air. The bustling city moved rapidly around me, businessmen checking their watches and couriers rushing past, entirely oblivious to the fact that I had just watched my entire personal life detonate. But the explosion did not leave me buried in rubble and ash. It forged me into something completely indestructible. I hailed a passing yellow taxi, slid into the scent of worn leather in the back seat, and immediately dialed a number I had recently committed to memory. Jamal answered on the second ring. His deep voice carried the exhausted, gritty tenor of a man who had spent the last several days systematically dismantling his own toxic marriage to my sister. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. I told him I needed his top-tier forensic accounting skills immediately. I quickly and precisely explained the video recording Connor's sickening confession and the imminent catastrophic collapse of his highly leveraged hedge fund. Jamal listened in absolute silence, absorbing the sheer scale of the treachery unfolding around us. When I finished detailing the $3 million life insurance plot, Jamal let out a low, humorless chuckle, remarking that my family truly possessed a bottomless, unprecedented capacity for evil. I leaned forward against the clear plastic partition of the taxi and outlined my immediate counterattack. Thanks to the massive, untraceable influx of cash I had secured from selling my proprietary medical algorithm to a rival tech giant, I possessed the exact kind of liquid capital Connor was desperately praying for. However, I had zero intention of offering him a lifeline. I instructed Jamal to activate the anonymous offshore shell company we had established together earlier that week. Operating entirely from the shadows, hidden securely behind layers of encrypted corporate veils and proxy directors, we were going to become Connor's absolute worst nightmare. I gave Jamal the green light to aggressively buy up every single piece of toxic defaulting debt tied to Connor's sinking hedge fund. I wanted my shell company to purchase the collateralized loans his firm was failing to service, acquiring them for pennies on the dollar from his panicked, fleeing institutional creditors. I could hear Jamal's fingers flying across his mechanical keyboard as we spoke, rapidly pulling up the public financial filings and shadow ledgers of my fiancé's firm. He confirmed that Connor's debt was bleeding heavily into the red, and his current creditors were desperate to offload the bad paper to anyone willing to assume the immense risk. By purchasing this toxic debt, my anonymous holding company would instantly become Connor's largest, most aggressive, and entirely unforgiving creditor. He would legally owe me his entire professional existence without ever knowing my real name. He believed he was marrying a fragile, dying woman to easily steal $3 million and run away with her sister. He had absolutely no idea he was legally binding himself to the very corporate entity that was quietly purchasing the rights to his absolute destruction. Jamal confirmed the massive wire transfers were initiating through our secure servers, buying up the debt blocks one by one. The financial trap was perfectly set, its steel jaws primed to snap shut the exact second Connor stood at the altar and spoke his vows. The days leading up to the cathedral ceremony evaporated into a quiet, focused blur of behind-the-scenes orchestration. Jamal and I seamlessly finalized the hostile takeover of Connor's toxic hedge fund debt, securing the financial bear trap under the impenetrable veil of my offshore holding company. While my mother, my sister, and my fiancé spent their days grinning through floral arrangements and champagne tastings, completely oblivious to the tightening noose, I spent mine, silently ensuring that the trap would snap shut with lethal precision. Then came the eve of the wedding. The rehearsal dinner was not an intimate family gathering. It was a highly publicized, heavily photographed social event. Connor's parents, a pair of rigid old money elites who viewed our marriage primarily as a highly beneficial public relations merger for their son's pristine corporate image, had rented out the entire private upper mezzanine of Chicago's most exclusive steakhouse. Flashbulbs from local society photographers popped near the brass-handled entrance, capturing the arrival of our elite guests. I arrived wearing a custom floor-length white silk dress, a stunning, delicate piece I had commissioned months before the cancer diagnosis had ever entered my life. I took my assigned seat at the head table wedged between Connor and his domineering mother Constance. Catherine and Sydney were seated directly across from us, their eyes gleaming with malicious anticipation. They did not waste a single moment launching their coordinated assault. As the servers distributed the first course of seared diver scallops and poured vintage champagne, Catherine loudly expressed her profound, entirely fabricated concern over my complexion. She purposefully projected her voice, so it carried clearly over the clinking silver and low jazz music, leaning toward Constance to remark on how terribly worried she was that I might simply collapse at the altar. She sighed heavily, stating that I looked dreadfully pale and withered, suggesting I was completely unsuitable for such a demanding public event. Sydney eagerly picked up the baton, leaning over her porcelain plate with a venomous smirk poorly disguised as sisterly sympathy. She loudly pointed out the dark circles beneath my eyes, shadows I had intentionally accentuated with a gray makeup pencil before leaving my condo just to maintain the illusion of my rapid decline. She asked Connor's father, a stoic man who visibly loathed public displays of weakness, if he had a standby physician ready in the cathedral wings. She chuckled lightly, suggesting that dragging a frail ghost down the aisle might ruin the aesthetic of the professional wedding photographs. They were ruthlessly playing to the elite crowd, tag-teaming to paint me as a broken, pathetic liability who should be pitied and hidden away rather than respected. Connor played his part in the charade flawlessly. He wrapped his arm around my waist, pulling me close, and adopted an expression of tragic, unwavering devotion. He kissed my temple, holding his breath exactly as he had confessed on the recording, hidden safely on my phone, and assured his wealthy parents that he would carry me down the aisle himself if my strength failed. It was a sickening, Oscar-worthy performance that made my skin crawl beneath the white silk, but I maintained my passive, serene expression, letting them revel in their assumed superiority. The main course of dry-aged steaks arrived and the expensive wine flowed freely. Sydney, having consumed 3 large glasses of a heavy Cabernet, decided that passive-aggressive verbal jabs were no longer sufficient to humiliate me. She wanted a physical spectacle. She wanted to break my composure in front of the people who mattered most to Connor's social standing. She stood up, holding her freshly poured, brimming glass of red wine, tapping her fork against the crystal rim to demand the room's attention. She announced she wanted to offer a heartfelt toast to the happy couple. As the mezzanine quieted and all eyes turned toward our table, Sydney reached across the white linen tablecloth, ostensibly to clink her glass against mine. As her arm extended over my plate, her hand miraculously slipped. With a violent, deliberate, and perfectly calculated flick of her wrist, she sent the entire contents of the deep crimson wine cascading directly onto my chest. The dark liquid splashed forcefully across the pristine white silk of my custom rehearsal dress, instantly blooming into a massive, undeniable blood-red stain. It soaked through the delicate fabric in seconds, chilling my skin and dripping heavily onto my lap. The entire upper mezzanine went dead silent. A chorus of horrified gasps erupted from the extended family and Connor's wealthy in-laws. Sydney immediately threw both hands over her mouth, launching into an exaggerated theatrical display of apologies. She cried out that she was so incredibly clumsy, her voice pitching into a faux panic. She repeatedly begged for forgiveness, swiping at the table with a napkin, all while her eyes met mine, glinting with absolute malicious triumph. She had successfully turned me into a public spectacle. Catherine rushed around the table to my side, not to offer genuine help, but to amplify the performance. She grabbed a cloth napkin and began roughly dabbing at the ruined silk on my chest, clucking her tongue loudly in mock despair. She turned to Constance and apologized profusely on my behalf, lamenting how difficult it was for me to handle public events in my current fragile state. She treated me like an incompetent toddler who had just soiled herself in public. The intent was crystal clear. They wanted to reduce me to a weeping, humiliated victim who could not even make it through a seated dinner without causing a disastrous, embarrassing scene. The old Madison would have fled the room in tears, hiding in the restroom, while the stains set into the fabric and the whispers circulated among the elite guests. But I did not cry. I did not flinch, and I did not run. I remained perfectly seated, ignoring the cold wine soaking into my skin, and looked directly into my sister's triumphant eyes. I smiled. It was a small, terrifyingly calm smile, that caused Sydney's theatrical fake sobs to falter for a fraction of a second. I gently but firmly pushed my mother's hands away from my chest. I calmly stood up, smoothing the ruined wine-soaked silk of my skirt, completely ignoring the massive stain that marked me like a target. I addressed the dead silent room, projecting my voice with a steady, unwavering authority that made Connor's parents blink in surprise. I assured my horrified future in-laws that it was merely a piece of fabric, a minor spill that meant absolutely nothing. I raised my water glass, looking directly at Connor, Sydney, and Catherine, and stated clearly that nothing in this world was going to ruin the absolute perfection of what was coming tomorrow. The moment I lowered my water glass and took my seat, I intentionally allowed my mask of fierce defiance to shatter. The toast had been a brilliant shock to their systems, but I could not sustain the Iron Lady routine if I wanted to properly execute the next phase of my retaliation. I needed Connor to feel superior, comfortable, and completely in control. So as the silence in the mezzanine stretched into an uncomfortable eternity, I forced my shoulders to slump forward. I quickened my breathing, letting my chest heave erratically as I stared down at the massive dripping red stain ruining my custom silk dress. I brought trembling hands up to cover my face, allowing genuine-looking tears to spill over my cheeks. I apologized profusely to Constance and Catherine, my voice cracking as I claimed the heavy anti-nausea medications were making me irrationally emotional and completely unhinged. Catherine and Sydney exchanged a swift, triumphant glance across the white linen tablecloth. They had successfully broken the fragile ghost. They had manufactured the exact breakdown they craved, reducing me to a weeping, humiliated mess in front of Chicago's upper crust. I turned blindly toward Connor, grabbing his forearm with a desperate, pathetic grip. I begged him to take me somewhere quiet, so I could clean myself up and catch my breath. Recognizing the perfect opportunity to play the devoted, protective groom for his wealthy parents and the lingering society photographers, he immediately sprang into action. He excused us from the table with a grave, concerned nod, wrapping his suit jacket around my ruined shoulders to shield me from the judgmental stares. He guided me away from the clinking crystal and the low jazz music, leading me down a carpeted corridor and into a secluded, dimly lit private wine tasting room adjacent to the main dining hall. As soon as the heavy mahogany door clicked shut, cutting off the ambient noise of the restaurant, his entire demeanor shifted. The tragic, supportive fiancé vanished. Connor stepped away from me, crossing his arms over his chest, with a heavy sigh of profound annoyance. There was no audience left to perform for, so he did not even bother offering me a napkin. He simply stared at the ceiling, waiting for my supposed panic attack to run its course so we could return to his networking event. I leaned against a towering rack of vintage bottles, dabbing uselessly at the red wine on my chest, my breathing still ragged. I looked up at him, my eyes wide and perfectly terrified. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a thick, legally bound document. I told him that my medical billing attorneys had ambushed me that very afternoon. I spun a frantic, highly convincing tale about my mounting oncology debts, claiming the research hospital was threatening to place aggressive liens on my future spouse's assets the absolute second we were legally married. I told him the bills for the experimental immunotherapy trial were astronomical, and the collectors were ruthlessly targeting any joint accounts we might open. I cried, stating that I could not bear the thought of my illness dragging down his pristine hedge fund, ruining his impeccable credit, or tarnishing his family's generational wealth. I held the thick stack of paper out to him with shaking hands. I presented it as a rushed emergency prenuptial agreement drafted solely to act as a titanium firewall between his millions and my inevitable medical bankruptcy. I practically begged him to sign it right then and there, painting myself as a guilty, desperate burden who just wanted to protect the incredible man she loved before it was too late. Connor's eyes lit up with a greedy, ravenous hunger. For a man who was secretly drowning in toxic debt, hovering on the precipice of a catastrophic financial collapse and a potential federal indictment, the concept of a legal shield was an irresistible godsend. He believed his hedge fund was failing, but he still thought he could salvage his personal wealth and steal my life insurance. The idea that my fake medical debt could somehow attach to him was a terrifying prospect. This document represented the ultimate protection. He did not know that Jamal, operating with absolute surgical precision, had drafted every single syllable of that contract. It was a masterpiece of legal deception designed to look exactly like standard asset protection on the first 3 pages. But buried deep within the dense, convoluted paragraphs of the liability clauses was a mutually binding catastrophic trigger. The hidden stipulation explicitly dictated that in the event either party canceled the wedding at the altar or was found guilty of committing any form of financial fraud, that party would immediately forfeit all of their personal and corporate assets. Furthermore, the guilty party would simultaneously assume the entirety of the other party's outstanding debts. Connor was so blinded by his own towering arrogance and so utterly convinced of my naive stupidity that he did not even bother to read past the first page. He saw the bold heading protecting his assets from medical liens, and his ego did the rest. He assumed a dying, panicked woman was simply handing him a blank check of immunity. He pulled a sleek silver pen from his jacket pocket, uncapped it with a swift, eager motion, and pressed it to the paper. He did not hesitate. He did not ask to run it by his own lawyers. He simply signed his name on the dotted line, sealing his own doom with a flourish of dark blue ink. He flipped to the final page and initialed the addendums without a second glance. The scratch of his pen against the thick parchment was the most beautiful, satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. He handed the executed document back to me, adopting a tone of magnanimous pity. He told me to stop worrying my sick little head about finances, assuring me that he was going to take care of absolutely everything. I slid the contract back into my clutch, the digital lock of his financial coffin snapping shut. I dried my tears, thanked him for his endless generosity, and walked back out into the dining room, carrying the weapon that would completely destroy him. The memory of his pen scratching against the thick parchment of the liability contract, dissolved, violently ripped away by the echoing, horrified murmurs bouncing off the vaulted stone ceiling of the cathedral. We were back in the present, standing at the ornate marble altar bathed in the kaleidoscopic light of the stained glass windows. The heavy, suffocating illusion I had maintained for months was finally lying in a crumpled synthetic heap on the floor. I stood before the congregation completely unmasked, the cool, conditioned air of the sanctuary rushing over my bare scalp. Connor was currently frozen 2 steps away from me, his perfectly styled hair gleaming under the altar lights. He had just delivered his rehearsed devastating line, his voice cracking with just the right amount of theatrical anguish, as he declared he could not marry a ghost, that he could not bind his life to a fading specter. He was playing the tragically overwhelmed groom to absolute perfection, seeking the pity of the elite crowd. From the front pew, my mother Catherine had immediately launched her own venomous volley. Her face was flushed with aristocratic fury, her pearls trembling against her collarbone as she hissed her disgust. She had loudly scolded me, her voice cutting through the shocked whispers of the guests, demanding to know why I had to humiliate the family on such a scale. She spat that my display was grotesque, that it was a pathetic cry for attention, and that a man of Connor's standing deserved to see exactly who he was dealing with before he signed his life away. The congregation of Chicago's wealthiest socialites, hedge fund managers, and old money matriarchs shifted uncomfortably in their polished oak pews. They whispered behind manicured hands, clutching their silk programs, staring at my bald head, as if it were a grotesque crime against their pristine aesthetic. Sydney sat beside my mother, wearing a mask of profound sisterly tragedy, though I could easily spot the malicious, triumphant gleam dancing in her eyes. She thought the game was over. She thought Connor was successfully executing their exit strategy, paving the way for the life insurance payout and their offshore escape. I did not collapse. I did not burst into the frantic, hyperventilating tears they all so desperately expected from the fragile, dying bride. Instead, I took a deep, steadying breath, drawing the scent of the massive white floral arrangements deep into my lungs. I slowly brought my hand up to my head, my fingertips grazing the smooth, bare skin of my scalp. I rubbed it with absolute, unapologetic pride. It was not a symbol of my impending death. It was the ultimate proof of my indestructible survival. It was the armor forged in the fires of their relentless treachery. I let my hand fall to my side, my posture straightening until I towered in my custom white gown. I ignored Connor's sudden faltering look of confusion and stepped purposefully around him. I walked past the stunned priest who was clutching his prayer book to his chest like a shield and approached the brass microphone stand positioned at the edge of the altar steps. I gripped the cool metal of the microphone. The speakers positioned throughout the massive cathedral emitted a sharp, high-pitched whine of feedback, instantly slicing through the murmurs and plunging the sanctuary into an absolute breathless silence. Every single eye in the building was locked directly onto me. My mother is absolutely right, I said, my voice echoing off the stone pillars, steady, resonant, and entirely devoid of fear. I looked directly down at Catherine, whose mouth fell slightly open in shock at my absolute composure. She just said that I was making a spectacle. She said that a man of Connor's immaculate standing deserves better than to be ambushed. She said he deserves to see exactly who he is dealing with today. I paused, letting the heavy words settle over the crowd, watching Connor's parents stiffen in the second row. For the very first time in my entire life, I agree with her completely. I turned my gaze slowly away from my mother, letting my eyes sweep across the hundreds of guests before locking directly onto Connor. His calculated mask of tragic grief was rapidly dissolving, replaced by a creeping primal panic. His jaw tightened, and he took a tiny, involuntary half-step backward. He recognized the tone in my voice. It was not the voice of the weak, pliable woman he thought he had been manipulating for the past 6 months. It was the voice of the corporate predator he was secretly terrified of becoming. "We came here today to make a lifelong commitment." I continued, speaking clearly into the microphone, ensuring every syllable rang with crystal clarity. "We stood before you all to pledge our honesty, our devotion, and our absolute transparency. But this entire cathedral is currently suffocating under a mountain of carefully constructed lies. You look at me and you see a tragic dying victim. You look at the man beside me and you see a devoted, grieving hero. But illusions, no matter how beautifully dressed or how expensively financed, cannot survive the light of day." I looked down at Sydney. Her smug satisfaction had entirely vanished, replaced by a rigid, wide-eyed terror. She gripped the edge of the wooden pew, her knuckles turning white. She knew something was catastrophically wrong, but she was completely powerless to stop it. "Connor absolutely deserves to know who he is dealing with," I announced to the silent, captivated room. "But more importantly, every single person sitting in these pews, every investor, every family member, and every supposed friend deserves to see exactly who is standing at this altar. You deserve to see the reality hidden behind the designer suits and the tragic tears." I stepped back from the microphone, my heart beating a steady, victorious rhythm against my ribs. I tilted my head back and looked high above the shocked congregation, past the towering gilded pipes of the massive church organ, aiming my gaze directly at the shadowed audio-visual balcony near the vaulted ceiling. Jamal's trusted tech operative was stationed up there, hidden from view, his hands hovering over the master control board. I raised my right hand, catching the operative's attention, and delivered a single sharp nod. The signal was given. Instantly, the ambient lighting in the cathedral dimmed, casting the altar in stark shadows. The two massive digital projection screens, originally installed on either side of the sanctuary to display the hymns and the tasteful pre-approved romantic photo montage Connor had insisted upon, suddenly flared to life with a blinding white light. The heavy booming hum of the cathedral's state-of-the-art audio system roared to life, vibrating through the marble floors and vibrating straight through the soles of my shoes. The trap I had so meticulously constructed was finally springing shut. The blinding white light on the dual projection screens sharpened, resolving into crisp, undeniably clear, high-definition color. The towering speakers, calibrated to perfection for a soaring choir, ceased their low hum and projected the crystal-clear audio directly into the massive nave. The image of my own living room materialized above the altar, magnified to colossal proportions. Every single guest in the cathedral was forced to look upon the undeniable sight of Connor and Sydney intimately entwined on my sofa, their faces projected 10 feet high for the entire congregation to witness. A collective gasp, sharp and unified, sucked the oxygen directly out of the massive sanctuary. I watched the blood drain from Connor's face, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. He froze his jaw slack, his eyes darting frantically between the two screens as his own recorded voice began to echo off the vaulted stone ceilings. The acoustics of the cathedral were flawless, amplifying his frantic, desperate greed so that not a single syllable could be ignored, rationalized, or misinterpreted. His voice boomed through the speakers, confessing the catastrophic reality of his highly acclaimed boutique hedge fund. The congregation, composed heavily of his wealthy, demanding investors and elite social peers, listened in paralyzed horror as Connor openly admitted to the absolute, unrecoverable freefall of his firm. They heard him confess to disastrous, highly leveraged bets on volatile tech startups. They heard his panicked admission that he was mere days away from total financial ruin and a potential federal indictment for grossly mishandling their carefully guarded capital. The elite crowd began to murmur, a low buzzing hive of outrage and shock, as the pristine illusion of Connor's professional brilliance shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of their eyes. But the professional disgrace was merely the prelude to the ultimate sickening revelation. The video continued its ruthless mechanical march forward. The entire church watched as the giant high-definition version of Connor leaned his forehead against my sister's shoulder. They heard the sickening punchline delivered with chilling, casual clarity. They heard him promise Sydney that he was only going through with our grand cathedral wedding to secure his ironclad legal status as my primary beneficiary. The words describing the $3 million life insurance policy echoed with a deafening boom through the sacred space, bouncing off the stained glass and striking the congregation like a physical blow. The horror escalated rapidly as Connor callously calculated the timeline of my illness for everyone to hear. He stated flatly, without a single ounce of hesitation or remorse, that my aggressive cancer would surely finish me off within 6 months of the wedding ceremony. The final devastating blow landed as he detailed his meticulously crafted exit strategy to immediately liquidate his failing firm. The second the massive insurance payout cleared the bank. Take the clean cash and flee with my sister to a luxury expatriate haven. Absolute, unadulterated pandemonium erupted within the cathedral walls. The stunned silence shattered into a chaotic symphony of outraged disgust and scandalized shouts. Constance Connor's mother let out a strangled, breathless cry, her manicured hands flying to her throat as her face turned the color of chalk. Her husband, a man whose entire existence was predicated on stoic superiority and untarnished social standing, gripped the edge of the wooden pew with white knuckles, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though his teeth might shatter under the pressure. They were watching their golden son publicly confess to a grotesque predatory plot, dragging their esteemed family name through the absolute lowest depths of the mud. The elite society members surrounding them recoiled physically, the whispers turning into loud, hostile declarations of disgust aimed directly at the front row. Catherine sat paralyzed, her eyes darting frantically between the towering screens and her precious golden daughter. Sydney looked as though she had been struck by lightning. She was trapped in the pew, her face a mask of rigid, wide-eyed terror, as her own voice betrayed her on the recording, eagerly agreeing to the twisted parasite fantasy. There was nowhere for her to run, no clever lie she could spin, and no tears she could manufacture to escape the massive, undeniable truth projected above her head. The people who had worshipped her beauty and charm were now staring at her with unabashed revulsion. Connor finally snapped. The sheer animal panic of a cornered predator entirely consumed his calculated, polished facade. He realized in a fraction of a second that his carefully curated public image, his desperately needed financial salvation, and his freedom were disintegrating in real time before his most vital investors. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He let out a feral, guttural scream that tore through his throat, a sound completely devoid of humanity and filled entirely with panicked fury. He lunged forward, his expensive tuxedo jacket straining across his shoulders as he threw his entire body weight toward the pulpit. His eyes were wide and manic, his hands outstretched like claws, desperately aiming to tear the microphone from my grasp or smash the audiovisual equipment to stop the broadcast. He wanted to silence me. He wanted to destroy the source of his exposure with his bare hands and drag me down into the ruins of his life. He never even made it past the first marble step. Two massive men in tailored plainclothes suits moved with the sudden terrifying speed of a striking viper. I had hired them weeks ago, explicitly instructing them to blend seamlessly into the front row of the congregation, anticipating exactly this kind of violent desperation. They intercepted Connor with brutal, flawless efficiency. One guard drove a heavy shoulder directly into Connor's chest, completely arresting his forward momentum with a sickening thud, while the other seized his outstretched arm, twisting it forcefully behind his back in a swift, practiced motion. Connor crashed heavily onto the cold marble floor of the altar, his polished dress shoes scrambling uselessly for traction against the smooth stone. The guards pinned him down instantly, one driving a knee firmly between his shoulder blades, neutralizing his furious thrashing resistance in a matter of seconds. He struggled wildly, screaming muffled, enraged curses against the marble, his face pressing into the floor, where we were supposed to share our vows. But the guards held him with absolute, immovable force. I stood perfectly still at the microphone, my posture tall and my expression serene, looking down at the sprawling, defeated mess of a man pinned at my feet while his recorded voice delivered the final damning sentence of the video above us. The echoes of Connor's recorded voice faded into the cavernous heights of the cathedral, replaced only by his heavy, ragged breathing as he struggled futilely against the polished marble floor. The two security guards held him in a vice grip, their expressions entirely blank, while the massive digital screens above us finally went dark, plunging the altar back into the warm, kaleidoscopic glow of the stained glass. The congregation remained frozen in a state of collective paralysis, completely unable to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal they had just witnessed. I kept my grip on the brass microphone, but my part in this specific act was concluded. I turned my head slightly, my eyes scanning the third row of the oak pews, finding the one man who possessed the power to deliver the final lethal blow to my mother and sister. Jamal stood up slowly from his seat. He did not rush, nor did he shrink under the sudden weight of 1,000 eyes snapping toward him. He wore an immaculately tailored charcoal suit projecting an aura of absolute terrifying professionalism. He stepped into the center aisle, the sharp click of his leather shoes echoing loudly against the stone floor. As he walked toward the altar, the sea of wealthy socialites, corporate titans, and hedge fund managers instinctively parted, leaning back in their wooden pews, as if making way for an executioner. He ascended the marble steps with measured precision, completely ignoring the thrashing groom pinned to the floor at my feet, and stepped directly to my side. I stepped back, yielding the microphone stand to him. Jamal adjusted the mic with a single swift motion. He looked out over the sea of pale, scandalized faces, his dark gaze sweeping the room with cold authority before locking directly onto the front pew where my mother and sister sat trembling. He introduced himself to the crowd, his voice deep, commanding, and carrying an undeniable weight of legal consequence. He stated his full name and presented his credentials, clarifying to the hushed cathedral that he was an independent forensic accountant, a specialist retained specifically by me to untangle complex webs of financial deceit. The word forensic sent a visible shudder through the elite crowd. They knew exactly what that title implied. It meant paper trails. It meant federal scrutiny. It meant absolute ruin. Jamal reached into the inner breast pocket of his charcoal jacket and retrieved a thick, heavily bound stack of bank records, wire transfer receipts, and audit logs. He held the massive stack of paper high in the air, a physical manifestation of impending destruction. He announced that while Connor's predatory greed was a despicable moral failing, it was at its core the desperate flailing of a failing businessman. However, Jamal continued, his voice dropping an octave so that it resonated menacingly through the speakers. The crimes committed by the bride's own family were far more insidious, crossing the strict line from moral bankruptcy into deliberate, calculated federal offenses. Catherine gripped the edge of her pew, her knuckles turning bone white, her perfect socialite posture crumbling into a defensive crouch. Sydney looked as though she might be physically sick, her eyes darting wildly toward the heavy wooden exit doors at the back of the sanctuary. Jamal did not give them a single second to formulate an escape plan. He cracked open the heavy dossier and began to read. He did not speak in vague accusations or emotional hyperbole. He spoke the cold, unforgiving language of mathematics, banking ledgers, and federal indictments. He methodically and loudly broke down the entire paper trail page by page. He read aloud the exact dates of the transactions, tracking the movement of illicit capital with surgical precision. He announced the name of the charity, a highly respected, federally subsidized foundation dedicated to funding experimental treatments for pediatric cancer patients. A collective gasp of sheer revulsion rippled through the pews. Stealing was one thing in these circles, but stealing from sick, dying children was an unforgivable, socially fatal atrocity, made all the more sickening by the fact that they were simultaneously using my own fake cancer diagnosis to garner sympathy. Jamal raised his voice to ensure the people in the very back rows heard every single digit. He read off the specific routing numbers of the shell accounts Catherine had established under Sydney's name, citing an offshore account ending in 4892. He detailed exactly how they had abused Catherine's trusted position on the charity's local advisory board. He explained that my mother had been creating fictitious vendor invoices and phantom grant disbursements, silently approving the transfers to slowly bleed the foundation dry. He stated the exact, irrefutable sum they had siphoned from the Pediatric Oncology Fund over the past 14 months. It was a staggering $150,000. He did not stop there. Jamal explained exactly where that stolen money had gone, tracing the laundered funds directly back to their selfish vanities. He read off the luxury boutiques, the high-end spas, and the exclusive vacation resorts where Sydney and Catherine had liquidated the stolen funds. He detailed $22,000 spent at a luxury jeweler and $14,000 wired to a private ski chalet in Aspen, proving how they had converted life-saving charity money into designer handbags and first-class plane tickets. He held up the bank statements bearing Sydney's digital signature and Catherine's authorizing stamps, waving the undeniable proof before the congregation. He stated flatly that a complete unredacted copy of this dossier had already been forwarded directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI, as well as the IRS, exactly 1 hour before the ceremony began. The cathedral erupted once again, but this time the noise was not just shock. It was pure, unadulterated outrage. Constance, who had built her entire social standing on leading prestigious charitable galas, looked at Catherine with an expression of absolute venomous disgust. The elite crowd began openly jeering the wealthy benefactors who had likely donated to that very charity, realizing they had been sitting side by side with common thieves. Catherine desperately tried to stand, opening her mouth to scream a denial, but no words came out. She was hyperventilating, her perfectly styled hair falling into her panicked, sweaty face, as the social elite of Chicago turned their backs on her in real time. Sydney was weeping openly now, not the fake theatrical tears from the rehearsal dinner, but the ugly, gasping sobs of a woman who had just realized she was going to federal prison. The destruction of their carefully curated lives was absolute, playing out precisely as I had planned. The devastating impact of Jamal's words hung in the suffocating air of the cathedral, but he was not finished dismantling the illusion. He turned slightly, aiming a single commanding finger toward the vaulted ceiling. High above the altar, the massive digital projection screens shifted with a blinding flash. The humiliating, larger-than-life image of Connor confessing to his financial ruin vanished, instantly replaced by a stark split-screen presentation of undeniable guilt. On the left side of the glowing displays, hovering 10 feet high against the ancient stone pillars, were the crisp, high-definition scans of the forged charity withdrawal slips. The crowd could clearly read the name of the Pediatric Oncology Foundation right above my mother's unmistakable looping authorizing signature. On the right side of the screens, perfectly aligned for brutal comparison, were the blindingly clear receipts from an exclusive luxury auto dealership in the Gold Coast. The dates of the massive bank withdrawals matched the dealership invoices perfectly. The sums mirrored each other down to the exact sickening cent. The congregation stared in paralyzed horror as Sydney's name appeared in bold black lettering on the title registration for a brand new custom-ordered Porsche. The visual juxtaposition was methodical, mathematical, and utterly inescapable. The gasps from the pews intensified into a low, thunderous roar of hostile muttering. The wealthy socialites, the hedge fund managers, and the old money matriarchs who populated the front rows were physically recoiling. These were their peers, their fellow charity gala attendees, seeing exactly how the lavish, enviable lifestyle my mother and sister flaunted was being directly funded by the theft of resources meant for dying children. The sheer brazen audacity of the crime broadcast in high definition across the sacred sanctuary was too massive to comprehend. The crushing weight of the public exposure finally snapped whatever fragile thread was holding Catherine's sanity together. She scrambled out of the polished wooden pew, her expensive heels clicking erratically and violently against the stone floor. She lunged toward the altar, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged desperation, her aristocratic posture entirely destroyed. She let out a piercing, guttural shriek, a sound so raw and frantic it echoed horribly through the cavernous nave, commanding Jamal to shut his mouth. She waved her arms wildly, her heavy diamond bracelets clanking together with an erratic, frantic rhythm as she desperately tried to claw back her ruined reputation. She shouted to the horrified congregation that the documents were fabricated, that the entire presentation was a malicious, elaborate setup. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Jamal, her voice cracking as she screamed that he was a traitor, a chronic liar, and a deeply resentful outsider trying to destroy a prominent family that had so graciously taken him in. She desperately tried to spin a frantic narrative of a disgruntled son-in-law seeking vengeance, her voice growing increasingly shrill and panicked, as the wealthy spectators simply stared back at her with hardened, unforgiving eyes. Nobody was buying the frantic performance. The evidence glowing brightly above her head was too massive, too absolute, and too perfectly documented. Jamal did not flinch. He stood as still and unyielding as a marble statue, letting the frantic waves of my mother's hysteria break uselessly against his iron composure. He did not raise his voice to match her frantic shrieking or attempt to argue with her unhinged denials. He simply stared down at her with a look of profound, chilling emptiness, possessing the absolute calm of a predator observing a trapped, flailing insect. He waited patiently for her to run out of breath, allowing the deafening acoustics of the cathedral to amplify her pathetic, frantic desperation for everyone to hear. When her screaming finally dissolved into heavy, panicked panting, the silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Catherine stood frozen at the base of the altar stairs, her chest heaving slowly, realizing that her social reign in Chicago was permanently and catastrophically over. Jamal slowly turned his gaze away from my ruined mother and looked directly at Sydney, who was still glued to the polished wood of the front pew, completely paralyzed by the unfolding disaster. With slow, deliberate movements, Jamal reached inside the tailored breast pocket of his charcoal jacket for a second time. The entire sanctuary held its breath, the tension in the air so thick it felt like physical weight. He produced a secondary folder much thinner than the massive financial dossier bound in a stark matte black cover. He stepped down off the elevated marble dais, closing the distance between the altar and the front row with slow, predatory strides. Sydney stared up at the black folder as if it were a loaded weapon, her eyes wide with a creeping primal terror. Jamal stopped precisely 2 feet away from her trembling knees. Without a single word of preface or hesitation, he flicked his wrist and threw the folder directly at her feet. It landed on the ancient stone floor with a sharp, resonant slap that echoed through the dead, silent church like a gunshot. Jamal looked down at his wife, his dark eyes entirely devoid of warmth, pity, or shared history. His voice, perfectly amplified by the lapel microphone he still wore, rang out with glacial finality. He announced to the breathless crowd that the folder contained fully executed, expedited divorce papers. He declared with a tone of absolute, unbreakable resolve that he refused to spend another second legally, financially, or morally bound to a parasite. The words struck Sydney like a physical blow, snapping her head back against the wooden pew. He stated loudly that he was immediately severing all ties, ensuring that when the federal authorities inevitably arrived to drag her out of her stolen luxury life, his clean name and immaculate professional record would not be anchored to her sinking ship. Having delivered the lethal blow, he turned his back on her, a gesture of absolute permanent dismissal, and walked slowly back up the altar steps to stand right by my side. The sheer finality of Jamal's cold rejection shattered the very last remaining fragment of Sydney's composure. The reality of her catastrophic situation crashed down upon her with the crushing force of a tidal wave. She had lost her handsome, wealthy backup plan, her stolen charity wealth, her pristine social standing, and her freedom all within the span of 15 agonizing minutes. A guttural, tearing sob ripped from her throat, a sound completely devoid of her usual manufactured grace. Her legs gave out entirely. She collapsed from the pew, crumbling onto the cold marble floor beside the black folder. She curled into a tight, miserable ball, her expensive silk dress pooling around her like a discarded wrapper as she brought her hands up to cover her face. She began to weep hysterically, her shoulders heaving with violent, gasping sobs that echoed pathetically through the cathedral. There were no cameras left to perform, for no rich benefactors left to manipulate, and no wealthy groom waiting to save her. There was only the cold, hard floor, the blinding light of her own financial crimes projected high above her, and the absolute certainty of her impending ruin. The piercing, wretched sound of Sydney's uncontrolled sobbing bounced off the vaulted ceilings, a pathetic soundtrack to her total annihilation. Jamal stood beside me on the elevated marble dais, an immovable pillar of righteous fury, his dark eyes surveying the absolute wreckage we had just created. Below us, the once immaculate sanctuary was suffocating under a heavy, paralyzed silence. The elite congregation sat entirely immobilized, their collective gaze shifting between the weeping woman crumpled on the floor and the furious, thrashing groom pinned against the cold stone. Connor was breathing heavily, his chest heaving against the unyielding weight of the two massive security guards pressing him into the polished marble. His expensive silk tie was twisted, his perfectly tailored tuxedo jacket riding up his shoulders in a rumpled mess. The sheer physical humiliation of being restrained like a common criminal in front of Chicago's most powerful investors was visibly tearing him apart. But his towering, blinding arrogance simply could not process the finality of his defeat. He refused to accept that the naive, easily manipulated woman he had intended to discard had so thoroughly dismantled his existence. With a violent, jerky motion, Connor twisted his head to the side, grinding his cheek against the stone floor just to lock his crazed, furious eyes onto mine. The mask of the tragic, heartbroken fiancé was entirely gone, replaced by the vicious, cornered animal underneath. He stopped struggling against the hands pinning his arms, and instead channeled every ounce of his remaining energy into a desperate, spiteful attempt to salvage his bruised ego. He bared his teeth, his voice straining into a harsh, ragged shout that echoed sharply through the cavernous nave. He screamed that I was a psychotic, unhinged monster. He bellowed to the shocked crowd that he would never bind his life to a deranged, vindictive lunatic. He twisted his neck, glaring up at the pulpit with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, and announced at the absolute top of his lungs that he was officially breaking off the engagement right here, right now. He let out a sharp, breathless laugh, a sound bordering on absolute madness, as he tried to spin his humiliation into a victory. He yelled that this elaborate, pathetic theatrical stunt meant absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things. He cruelly boasted that regardless of what was projected on those massive screens, I was still a fading terminal ghost with an expiration date. He spat the words like venom, claiming that I would die penniless, rotting away in some sterile hospital bed, entirely alone, while he would recover from this minor setback, pivot his firm, and leave my memory in the dust. He genuinely believed that by publicly rejecting me, by discarding me before the priest could finish the ceremony, he was seizing the final word and reclaiming his power. I stood behind the brass microphone, staring down at his furious, flushed face. I did not flinch at his cruel insults. I did not shed a single tear at his vicious predictions about my death. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of relief, but one of cold, calculating triumph. His public rejection was the exact, precise trigger I had been waiting for. It was the final, fatal misstep in a long sequence of arrogant blunders. "Thank you, Connor," I said smoothly into the microphone, my voice steady, amplified, and ringing with absolute authority. "Thank you for saying that so loudly, and thank you for making that specific declaration in front of hundreds of witnesses." His manic laughter faltered. His eyes narrowed in sudden creeping confusion. I reached down into the hidden wooden shelving built into the back of the pulpit. My fingers found the familiar heavy texture of the thick parchment I had placed there earlier that morning. I pulled out the legally bound document holding the dense stack of paper high in the air for the entire congregation to see. The warm light from the stained glass windows caught the stark white pages and the dark blue ink of his hurried signature on the back page. "Do you remember the private wine tasting room, Connor?" I asked, my voice echoing through the silent cathedral. "Do you remember the emergency prenuptial agreement I handed you? The one you signed without reading a single word because you were so incredibly eager to shield your precious hedge fund from my impending medical bankruptcy?" Connor stopped breathing. The color that had rushed to his face in anger instantly drained away, leaving him a sickening translucent white. He stared up at the document in my hand, his chest freezing against the marble floor. "You thought you were signing a titanium firewall to protect your assets." I continued, savoring the absolute horror dawning in his wide eyes. "But you were so blinded by your own towering ego that you did not bother to review the liability clauses on page 4. Jamal is not just a forensic accountant. He is a master of legal structuring, and he drafted every single syllable of this contract with surgical precision." I opened the heavy document, flipping directly to the 4th page. I flattened the crease and leaned closer to the microphone, ensuring that not a single syllable would be lost on the captivated crowd. "Let me read the hidden stipulation you so eagerly initialed," I announced, my tone transforming into the rigid clinical cadence of a corporate litigator. Section 4, Paragraph 7. In the event that either party officially cancels the wedding at the altar, or is found guilty of committing any form of financial fraud, that party shall immediately and irrevocably forfeit all personal and corporate assets to the injured party. A sharp collective gasp rippled through the front rows. Connor's father let out a strangled, breathless choke, recognizing the fatal binding nature of the legal trap his son had blindly walked into. I kept my eyes locked directly on Connor's terrified face as I read the final devastating sentence. Furthermore, the forfeiting party shall simultaneously assume the entirety of the injured party's outstanding debts, liabilities, and financial obligations, effective immediately upon verbal cancellation of the nuptials. I lowered the document, resting it against the polished wood of the pulpit. The silence in the cathedral was absolute, heavy, and totally suffocating. "By officially breaking off our engagement right here at the altar in front of all these witnesses, you have legally activated the trap," I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy air. "You do not own your failing hedge fund anymore, Connor. You do not own your luxury penthouse. You do not own your offshore accounts or your sports cars. As of this exact second, I own absolutely everything that bears your name." Connor let out a raw, wretched sound, a hollow wheeze of a man whose soul had just been ripped directly out of his chest. He slumped completely flat against the cold stone, all the fight instantly leaving his body. He realized with absolute crushing certainty that his arrogant boast had been the very mechanism of his own destruction. He had not just lost the $3 million life insurance payout, he had handed me the keys to his entire existence, assuming my manufactured medical debts while surrendering every last cent he possessed. He was financially ruined, legally bound, and utterly trapped in a cage of his own making. The silence in the cathedral was absolute, heavy, and totally suffocating. Connor lay pinned against the cold marble, his eyes wide and vacant, as his brain desperately tried to process the fatal mathematics of the prenuptial agreement. He believed he finally understood the depths of the trap. He believed his ultimate punishment was the cruel irony of absorbing my fabricated astronomical medical debts while simultaneously handing over whatever meager hidden liquid assets he had managed to squirrel away from his failing firm. He thought that was the absolute bottom. He was spectacularly wrong. I stepped out from behind the heavy wooden pulpit, the train of my pristine white gown gliding smoothly over the ancient stone steps. I walked down to the edge of the elevated dais, looking down at the man who had spent the last year eagerly anticipating my death. I held the brass microphone effortlessly, my voice dropping to a conversational, almost intimate volume that somehow carried with crystal clarity to the very back rows of the terrified congregation. I addressed Connor directly, my tone entirely conversational, asking him if he truly thought I had spent the last 12 months lying weakly in a sterile hospital bed, passively waiting for an imaginary tumor to claim my life. I watched his brow furrow, a flicker of raw, desperate confusion cutting through his absolute terror. I informed him that my frequent extended absences, the days and weeks he happily assumed I was undergoing grueling chemotherapy or recovering from exhausting radiation, were indeed spent in a brightly lit, sterile environment. But it was not an oncology ward. It was a high-security server room at a downtown tech incubator. I announced to the dead silent cathedral that I was never sick. I was simply busy. I explained that the complex diagnostic algorithm I had been developing for the past 3 years, the very same project he had routinely and arrogantly mocked as a cute little hobby to keep my mind off my impending demise, had finally been perfected. I let the words hang in the air for a fraction of a second before delivering the first devastating payload. I stated clearly, enunciating every single syllable, that exactly 1 month ago, a massive Silicon Valley healthcare conglomerate had purchased my proprietary medical algorithm in a closed expedited acquisition. The final sale price was an unredacted immediate cash transfer of $35 million. The collective gasp that tore through the sanctuary was deafening. The wealthy elite sitting in the pews, people who measured human worth strictly in capital equity and yield, stared at me as if I had just materialized from thin air. I was not a tragic, dying charity case looking for a final few months of comfort. I was at this exact moment significantly wealthier than nearly everyone sitting in the room. Connor's jaw went completely slack. The security guard still held his arms firmly against the floor, but he had completely stopped fighting them. He stared up at me, his chest barely moving, his eyes darting frantically as he tried to comprehend the staggering magnitude of his miscalculation. He had spent months enduring a relationship with a woman he despised, counting down the days until he could collect a paltry $3 million life insurance payout, completely oblivious to the fact that he was sleeping next to a woman worth more than 10 times that amount. The sheer blinding greed that had driven his every deceitful action had simultaneously blinded him to the actual gold mine sitting right in front of him. But I was not finished. The true poetry of his destruction had not yet been fully revealed. I walked down the final marble step, standing mere inches from where Connor was pinned to the floor. I crouched down gracefully, my heavy silk gown pooling around me like water, bringing my face perfectly level with his sweating, panicked features. I spoke softly into the microphone, ensuring the entire congregation heard the final lethal twist of the blade. I asked him if he remembered the name of the aggressive anonymous venture capital firm that had systematically and ruthlessly bought up all of his hedge funds' defaulted loans over the last 6 months. I watched the remaining blood completely drain from his face as I uttered the name of the shadowy corporate entity that had been haunting his nightmares. It was the phantom creditor that had mercilessly cornered his firm, blocked every attempt at refinancing, and forced him to the absolute brink of insolvency. He knew the name intimately. It was the monster that kept him awake at night, the relentless debt collector he could never trace, never negotiate with, and never outrun. I smiled a slow, terrifying expression of absolute unyielding victory. I informed him that the anonymous shell company was not run by a syndicate of ruthless offshore investors. It was a limited liability corporation registered in Delaware, entirely structured by Jamal, and solely owned and operated by me. I had used the initial 8-figure advance payment from my algorithm sale to silently purchase every single ounce of his toxic defaulted debt. I owned his failure. I owned his firm's collapse. I was his phantom executioner. I stood back up, towering over his prone form, the microphone held firmly in my grip. I methodically broke down the legal reality of the prenuptial agreement he had just foolishly activated. By shouting his rejection at the altar, he had legally forfeited whatever meager hidden assets he still possessed, handing them directly to me. But far more importantly, by activating the penalty clause, he had legally assumed all of my outstanding liabilities. I explained to the horrified crowd that my only active liabilities were the operational margins of the shell company I used to purchase his toxic debt. He had not assumed my medical bills because there simply were none. Instead, by attempting to scam a dying woman, Connor had inadvertently signed a legally binding document that stripped him of his corporate liability shield. He had personally assumed the millions of dollars in toxic debt that his own failing hedge fund had generated. The massive debt he thought he could escape by marrying me was now chained directly and permanently to his personal social security number. He owed millions, and he owed every single cent of it directly to me. Connor let out a sound that was barely human, a hollow, breathless wheeze of a man plunging into a dark, endless abyss. His eyes rolled back slightly, his mind completely snapping under the weight of the mathematical impossibility he was now trapped within. There was no loophole, no clever legal maneuver, and no wealthy benefactor who could save him now. He was officially, entirely, and irreversibly bankrupt. He was permanently chained to a mountain of toxic debt he could never possibly repay, stripped of his assets, his reputation, and his future. The absolute crushing finality of his ruin settled over the cathedral, a masterpiece of destruction executed with flawless, unforgiving precision. The crushing finality of Connor's ruin settled over the cathedral, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt like a vacuum. I looked past the broken, hyperventilating man pinned to the marble and shifted my gaze to the base of the dais, where my mother stood completely frozen. For the past 20 minutes, Catherine had been desperately clinging to the delusion that there was a way out. She had believed that Connor's vast hedge fund wealth would somehow buy their way out of a federal indictment, that his financial power could shield her from the consequences of stealing from dying children. Now that final, desperate safety net had been incinerated right before her eyes. Not only was the money gone, but the very man she had worshipped as their savior was completely, irreversibly bankrupt. He owed me millions. He was worse than useless to her now. He was a walking liability. I watched the exact moment her mind simply ceased to function. The aristocratic mask, carefully curated over decades of country club luncheons, charity galas, and ruthless social climbing, dissolved into a raw, grotesque portrait of feral rage. Her jaw unhinged, her eyes, usually so cold, composed, and calculating, rolled wildly, flashing, with a manic-cornered desperation. The glittering social empire she had sacrificed my entire childhood to build was gone, replaced by the terrifying, undeniable certainty of a concrete prison cell. She had nothing left to lose, and in that realization she lost her sanity completely. A guttural, animalistic scream ripped from her throat, a sound so unnatural and violent, it caused the front row of wealthy guests to physically recoil in horror. She reached up and violently ripped the heavy diamond necklace from her throat, as if it were choking her, throwing the precious stones blindly into the pews. She kicked off her custom designer heels, the stilettos clattering sharply against the ancient stone floor. Without a single word of warning, she launched herself up the marble stairs. She did not look like a grieving mother, a humiliated socialite, or the mother of the bride. She looked like a rabid animal out for blood. Her manicured hands curled into jagged claws, her face contorted with a venomous, unhinged desire to physically tear me apart. She was screaming my name, a string of vile, incoherent curses spilling from her mouth as she charged directly at the pulpit. I did not take a single step backward. I did not flinch, nor did I raise a hand to defend myself. I simply gripped the brass microphone stand and watched her come, my expression completely blank, my heart beating with a steady, triumphant rhythm. I knew I was perfectly safe. The two massive private security guards who had been restraining Connor did not miss a beat. They operated with the cold, mechanical efficiency of professionals who dealt with high-stakes violence every single day. As Catherine cleared the final marble step, lunging toward my throat with her arms outstretched and her teeth bared, the guard on the left released Connor's shoulder and pivoted with blinding speed. He stepped smoothly into Catherine's path, lowering his center of gravity. He did not strike her, but simply absorbed her frantic, reckless momentum. He wrapped a thick, muscular arm around her waist, shifting his hips to completely upend her balance. The momentum of her own unhinged charge betrayed her. The guard effortlessly redirected her trajectory, lifting her slightly, before driving her down onto the unforgiving stone floor with a heavy, echoing thud. Catherine hit the marble hard, the breath rushing out of her lungs in a sharp, audible gasp. Before she could even attempt to scramble back to her feet or swing her clawed hands, the second guard shifted his weight. He moved flawlessly to assist his partner, pressing his heavy knee firmly between Catherine's shoulder blades while securing both of her flailing wrists behind her back. Within 3 seconds, the manic assault was entirely neutralized. Catherine was now pinned flat on her stomach, her cheek pressed flush against the cold floor, lying mere inches away from where Connor was still secured. The visual poetry of the moment was profound. The two chief architects of my suffering, the greedy, manipulative groom and the narcissistic, thieving mother, were now immobilized side by side at the foot of the altar. Their expensive, tailored clothes were rumpled and ruined, their dignity entirely shattered, physically subdued, and pressed into the dirt by the very security forces I had hired to protect my operation. Catherine thrashed wildly against the pressure on her back, spitting and screaming like a woman possessed. She demanded they let her go, shrieking that she knew the mayor, the chief of police, and every powerful judge in Chicago. She wailed that she would have the guards fired, sued, and ruined. The security personnel remained completely silent and impassive, adjusting their grips to ensure she could not move an inch while she exhausted herself against their weight. The elite crowd watched in total paralyzed horror. The wealthy benefactors, the corporate titans, and the high society matriarchs were witnessing the complete, undignified breakdown of a woman they had dined with just days prior. The illusion of her superiority was entirely broken, replaced by the pathetic reality of a cornered criminal throwing a violent temper tantrum on the floor of a church. Then, cutting cleanly through Catherine's frantic, echoing shrieks, a loud metallic grinding echoed from the very back of the sanctuary. The heavy iron latch on the main entrance was being thrown open with immense, urgent force. The massive, ancient oak doors of the cathedral violently swung outward, slamming against the stone walls with a thunderous boom that shook the very foundations of the building. The dim, warm, candlelit illumination of the church vestibule was instantly invaded by a harsh, strobing glare. The aggressive, chaotic flashing of red and blue emergency lights spilled violently into the lobby, piercing the solemn shadows of the cathedral and painting the towering stone pillars in frantic, alternating colors. The rhythmic, mechanical sweep of the police cruiser's light bars cast long, distorted shadows down the center aisle, cutting straight through the sea of horrified wedding guests. The brilliant red and blue flashes illuminated the terrified faces of the congregation, blinking rapidly against the stained glass windows. The heavy, rhythmic thud of heavy boots hitting the stone floor echoed from the entrance. It was a stark, undeniable confirmation that the theoretical threat of federal consequences had just become a physical reality. The authorities had arrived. A phalanx of men and women in dark, weatherproof windbreakers poured through the open threshold of the cathedral, moving with a synchronized, tactical urgency that instantly commanded absolute compliance. The flashing emergency lights from the street outside cast long, chaotic shadows across their faces as they marched in perfect, intimidating formation down the center aisle. The wealthy congregation, already reeling from the catastrophic public executions they had just witnessed, scrambled over themselves to get out of the way, pressing their backs hard against the polished oak pews. As the tactical team drew closer to the altar, the stark, bright yellow letters printed across the backs of their jackets became unmistakably clear. They were not local Chicago police officers responding to a domestic disturbance. They were federal agents. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a grim, deeply lined face, bypassed the terrified guests entirely and walked straight toward the marble dais where Jamal and I were standing. Jamal gave the man a brief, knowing nod, a subtle gesture of professional recognition that sent a fresh shockwave of comprehension through the breathless crowd. This raid was not a spontaneous reaction to the documents projected on the massive screens above us. It was a meticulously coordinated sting operation. Jamal and I had not simply sent an anonymous email to the authorities an hour before the ceremony. We had walked directly into the federal building a full week prior, personally handing over the massive unredacted forensic audit to the Financial Crimes Division. The FBI had spent the last 7 days verifying the ledgers, securing the necessary subpoenas, and quietly drafting the federal arrest warrants. Embezzling from a registered, federally subsidized 501c3 charity was not a local misdemeanor to be handled by a municipal judge. It was a massive, highly prioritized federal offense, carrying mandatory minimum sentencing and drawing the immediate wrathful attention of the United States government. We had simply provided the FBI with the perfect contained venue to execute their warrants while simultaneously ensuring my family suffered maximum inescapable social destruction. The lead agent gestured to the two private security guards who still had Catherine pinned flush against the cold stone floor. At his silent command, my hired men seamlessly stepped back, transferring control of the disgraced socialite directly to the federal authorities. Two agents hauled my mother roughly to her feet. The fight had finally drained out of her, replaced by a vacant, hollow terror. Her custom designer dress was torn at the shoulder, smudged with dust from the ancient floor, and her meticulously styled hair hung in a chaotic, sweaty tangle across her panicked face. The lead agent recited her Miranda rights in a loud, monotonous drone that carried through the dead-silent church, officially charging her with multiple counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and federal embezzlement. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around her wrists sounded like a final slamming cell door. Catherine did not scream or fight this time. The reality of the cold steel biting into her skin completely broke her mind, leaving her a trembling, hyperventilating shell of the terrifying matriarch she used to be. A few feet away, another pair of federal agents approached the front pew, where Sydney was still curled into a miserable weeping ball. She flinched violently as they grabbed her arms, pulling her up from the floor. She sobbed incoherently, shaking her head and begging Jamal to tell them it was all a mistake, desperately looking toward the man who had just served her divorce papers for salvation. Jamal simply looked away, adjusting his tailored cuffs with an expression of complete chilling indifference. The agent spun Sydney around, forcing her arms behind her back, and secured her wrists with a second pair of steel handcuffs. The visual of the pampered, arrogant golden child being shackled in her extravagant bridesmaid gown was a portrait of ultimate, undeniable ruin. Her mascara was running in thick black streams down her cheeks, her perfectly manicured nails scraping uselessly against the heavy metal cuffs. The agents turned the two disgraced women around and began the long, agonizing march back down the center aisle. It was the exact same path they had proudly strutted down just an hour earlier, completely convinced of their own untouchable superiority. Now it was an excruciating walk of shame. The Chicago elite, the very people Catherine had spent decades manipulating and desperate to impress, watched them pass with expressions of pure, unadulterated disgust. Former friends, business partners, and gala co-chairs actively turned their backs, refusing to make eye contact with the common thieves being paraded through the sanctuary like trophies. The whispers and gasps from the pews were no longer filled with shock, but with absolute revulsion. The total rejection of their peers was a social death sentence executed in real time under the flashing red and blue lights of the federal cruisers parked outside. At the base of the altar, the private security guards finally stepped away from Connor, releasing their heavy grip on his shoulders. The federal agents completely ignored him as they marched my mother and sister out of the building. Connor was not under federal investigation for the charity fraud, but his freedom offered absolutely no salvation. He remained crumpled on the cold marble floor, completely alone, weeping pathetically into his hands, as the heavy oak doors slammed shut, sealing the fate of the women he had conspired with. He was a financially ruined, thoroughly broken shell of a man crushed beneath the weight of millions in toxic debt left behind to rot in the wreckage of his own towering greed, while the crowd simply watched him fall apart. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral slamming shut on Connor's pathetic, echoing sobs was the final defining sound of my old life. I did not look back. I walked down the stone steps and into the crisp Chicago afternoon, leaving the wreckage of their greed entirely behind me. Exactly 365 days later, the stifling ancient air of that church was nothing but a distant memory, replaced entirely by the sharp, salty breeze of the Pacific Ocean. I stood on the edge of a bright, sun-drenched cliff in Carmel, California, my toes sinking into the warm, golden sand of a private beachfront terrace. The endless expanse of the ocean stretched out before me, a brilliant, glittering sapphire blue that mirrored the absolute clarity of my new existence. I closed my eyes and took a long, deep breath, expanding my lungs to their absolute capacity. The air tasted of sea salt and pine, clean and vital. There was no pain, There was no fatigue. There was only the vibrant, thrumming rhythm of a perfectly healthy body. My oncologist had delivered the final definitive blood work and scans just 2 weeks prior. The results were indisputable. I was 100% in remission. The shadow that had once loomed over my future, the terrifying diagnosis that my so-called family had eagerly tried to weaponize for their own financial gain, had been entirely eradicated. I was no longer a patient, and I was certainly no longer a victim. I opened my eyes and ran a hand over my head, smiling at the tactile sensation of the ocean breeze against my scalp. For months I had suffocated beneath hot, itchy concealing wigs, playing the part of the fading, tragic invalid to keep Connor and Catherine entirely comfortable in their delusions. I had burned every single one of those synthetic prisons the day I arrived in California. Now I sported a chic, natural short pixie cut. It was sharp, elegant, and entirely unapologetic. It framed my face not as a badge of illness, but as a striking crown of survival and absolute rebirth. I was no longer hiding from anyone. I walked across the smooth cedar planks of my expansive deck, the morning sun warming my skin, and picked up my tablet from the patio table. Jamal, who had seamlessly transitioned from my forensic accountant to the chief financial officer of my newly established tech firm, had sent his weekly briefing. Nestled beneath the soaring quarterly projections of my medical algorithms' integration into national hospital networks was a customized digital news clipping. Jamal always made sure I was kept abreast of the ongoing fallout in Chicago. The federal justice system had moved with a relentless, unforgiving speed. The extensive, perfectly documented forensic audit Jamal and I had handed over to the FBI left absolutely zero room for negotiation or plea deals. The trial of Catherine and Sydney had been a spectacular, highly publicized media circus. The Chicago elite, the very people my mother had spent her entire adult life ruthlessly climbing over to secure her social dominance, had treated the trial as the ultimate spectator sport. They packed the gallery just to watch the mighty fall. Catherine had attempted to maintain her aristocratic haughtiness in the courtroom right up until the federal judge delivered the sentence. She and Sydney were convicted on multiple counts of federal wire fraud, charity embezzlement, and tax evasion. The judge had been openly disgusted by their systematic theft from a foundation designed to aid terminally ill children, issuing maximum sentences with no possibility of early parole. My mother and sister, women who once defined their worth by the brand of their handbags and the exclusivity of their zip code, were currently serving out their multi-year sentences in a federal correctional institution in downstate Illinois. They had been stripped of their designer gowns and heavy diamond jewelry, forced into identical ill-fitting khaki jumpsuits. But the loss of their freedom was only half of their punishment. The court had ordered massive, crippling restitution fines to repay the charity. Every single legitimate asset they possessed had been seized and auctioned off by the government. The sprawling suburban estate, the luxury vehicles, the offshore accounts, all of it was liquidated. They were entirely destitute, forced to perform menial prison labor for cents an hour, their glittering social empire reduced to absolute dust. Connor's fate, meticulously detailed in the second half of Jamal's briefing, was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. His desperate, frantic attempts to void the prenuptial agreement in civil court had failed spectacularly. The judge had taken one look at the binding liability clauses Connor had arrogantly signed without reading and upheld the contract in its entirety. Connor was legally bound to the millions of dollars in toxic debt generated by his own catastrophic business failures. His hedge fund was immediately liquidated. Federal regulators and aggressive creditors descended on his firm like vultures, seizing his penthouse, his sports cars, and his frozen bank accounts. But the liquidation only covered a fraction of what he owed. The remaining balance, the massive, suffocating mountain of debt I had purchased through my anonymous shell company, remained firmly chained to his personal social security number. To satisfy the aggressive court-ordered wage garnishments dictated by my holding company, Connor was now forced to work a grueling minimum wage job. The former titan of Chicago finance, the man who used to mock the working class from the balcony of his luxury condo, was currently employed as a night shift logistics clerk at a massive windowless shipping warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He spent his nights scanning barcodes and moving heavy boxes in a drafty concrete facility, wearing a cheap synthetic uniform. Every Friday, the moment his meager paycheck was deposited, the bank automatically siphoned 80% of his earnings directly into my corporate accounts. He was trapped in a perpetual cycle of exhausting manual labor, living in a cramped studio apartment, working solely to pay off a debt to the woman he had tried to discard. I locked the tablet screen and set it back on the table, feeling a profound, tranquil sense of closure. The scales were completely balanced. They were trapped in the miserable cages they had constructed with their own greed, while I stood in the golden California sunlight, breathing in the ocean air, with my entire life stretching out before me brilliantly and endlessly free. I turned away from the endless glittering expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the cool coastal breeze playfully catching the short textured strands of my pixie cut. I left the edge of the cliff and walked back across the smooth cedar decking my bare feet, eventually finding the manicured stone pathway that led away from the private beachfront. I was not heading toward a secluded retirement sanctuary or a quiet place of convalescence. I was walking directly toward the towering, triumphant culmination of my life's work. Rising majestically against the bright Californian sky stood a breathtaking, ultra-modern structure of sweeping steel and soaring glass walls. It was a marvel of contemporary architecture, entirely transparent and brilliantly illuminated by the morning sun. This was the newly minted headquarters of the Madison Hayes Foundation for Advanced Medical Technology. The monumental $35 million from the sale of my diagnostic algorithm had not merely financed the absolute ruin of my enemies, it had laid the concrete and steel foundation for this sprawling research campus. The building was designed with purposeful transparency, a stark, deliberate rejection of the shadows, secrets, and deceit that had suffocated my previous life in Chicago. Here, behind these massive walls of clear glass, brilliant minds were assembling to develop next-generation oncological software dedicated to detecting terminal illnesses years before they could become a death sentence for anyone else. A sizable crowd of esteemed medical researchers, top-tier software developers, and local dignitaries was gathered on the immaculate emerald green front lawn. A thick, vibrant red silk ribbon was stretched tightly across the main entrance, fluttering slightly in the steady ocean wind. The atmosphere was electric, buzzing with genuine anticipation and shared purpose. Standing right beside the brass stanchions, holding a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors, was Jamal. He looked absolutely impeccable in a sharp-tailored navy suit, the California sun catching the silver of his watch as he checked the time. He caught my eye as I approached, flashing a smile so wide and genuine it radiated pure joy. He was no longer just the brilliant calculating forensic accountant who had engineered the spectacular legal and financial downfall of my ex-fiancé. He was officially the chief financial officer of my new foundation, my most trusted confidant, and without question my closest friend. We had navigated the absolute darkest trenches of corporate sabotage, legal peril, and familial betrayal together. We had built a bond forged in the fire of righteous vengeance and absolute loyalty. He had stood by me when I was a bald, exhausted woman plotting a hostile takeover from a hospital bed, and he stood by me now as a titan of the medical tech industry. I stepped up to the podium situated just behind the crimson ribbon. The polite, enthusiastic applause of the gathered crowd washed over me. It was a beautiful, resonant sound, a stark and total contrast to the horrified, suffocating gasps that had echoed through the cavernous nave of that cathedral exactly 1 year ago. Jamal stepped forward, handing me the heavy silver scissors. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a warm, private whisper meant only for me. He told me that I had earned every single second of this victory, that the world was finally getting to see the real me. I took the heavy scissors, the cool metal grounding me firmly in the reality of the present moment. I looked out at the brilliant assembly of professionals before me, people who were ready to change the world, and then I caught my own reflection in the towering glass doors of the foundation. For so long I had equated my femininity, my inherent worth, and my basic humanity with the long flowing hair I had lost to the illness. I had cowered beneath stifling synthetic wigs, terrified that the world would look at my bare, smooth scalp and see nothing but a broken, defective creature marked for death. I had believed the cruel, whispered insults of my mother and sister, internalizing the idea that my illness made me undesirable and weak. But staring at my sharp, natural reflection now, I finally understood the profound, undeniable truth. Losing my hair had never made me less of a woman. It had simply acted as a ruthless, infallible filter. It had stripped away my superficial armor and laid bare the hideous, shallow monsters lurking inside my own home. My illness had not diminished me. It had illuminated the parasitic greed of the people I had been conditioned to love. Connor. Catherine and Sydney had looked at my diagnosis and seen nothing but a convenient expiration date, a fast track to an unearned fortune. They had treated my impending death as a lucrative financial windfall, plotting to exploit my tragedy for their own gain. The day Connor screamed his vicious rejection at the altar, intending to humiliate me in front of Chicago's most powerful elite, was never the tragedy I had initially feared. It was, in fact, the greatest, most profound blessing of my entire existence. That brutal, highly public abandonment was not a heartbreak. It was a radical, life-saving operation. It was the precise surgical removal of a massive toxic tumor, disguised as my family and my future husband. By cutting them out, by legally and financially excising their narcissism and greed from my life, I had cured myself of a sickness far more lethal than any physical ailment I had ever faced. I positioned the sharp blades of the ceremonial scissors around the thick red silk. I did not feel a single ounce of regret for the absolute devastation I had left behind in Illinois. The people who had tried to bury me were now buried in cages of their own making while I was standing in the light. I squeezed the handles together with absolute certainty. The heavy blades sliced cleanly through the fabric, severing the ribbon with a satisfying resonant snap. The crowd erupted into loud celebratory cheers, the joyful noise blending perfectly with the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves behind me. I handed the scissors back to Jamal and smiled a genuine expression of total freedom as I stepped forward through the open glass doors. The toxic infection was entirely gone. I was finally truly ready to live. The powerful story of Madison's triumph teaches us a profound lesson about self-worth and the true definition of family. Often the people who are supposed to protect and love us unconditionally are the ones blinded by greed and superficiality. Madison's journey perfectly illustrates that being abandoned by toxic individuals is not a tragic loss, but rather a necessary life-saving surgery. It clears the path for genuine healing and allows us to surround ourselves with loyal people who truly value us for exactly who we are, not what we can provide. Share your own experience of finding freedom and comment below.